Somewhere around 3,000 years ago, people who had never met each other, who lived on opposite sides of the planet, who spoke completely different languages and worshipped completely different gods, all came to the same unsettling conclusion. History doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in a circle. And every circle has an ending. Think about that for a second. Ancient Indian scholars mapped out a cosmic calendar stretching across millions of years, dividing all of existence into ages that decline from golden to catastrophic. On the other side of the world, the Maya were carving a completely different calendar into stone, tracking great cycles that turn over like the hands of a cosmic clock. The Greeks wrote about ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each one worse than the last. The Norse saw time building toward a final cataclysm that would destroy and remake everything. The Zoroastrians in ancient Persia calculated world ages measured in thousands of years, each one moving toward a final renovation of the cosmos. The Aztecs believed we are living in the fifth sun, the fifth version of the world, because the previous four were destroyed. 5 completely separate civilizations, 5 completely separate calendars. And somehow they all landed on roughly the same idea. That time is structured, that history has chapters, and that every chapter ends. Now here's the question that keeps you up at night, if you think about it long enough. Why? Why does every one of these traditions describe the ending of an age in almost exactly the same way? Not the same mythology, not the same gods, not the same names, but the same pattern. It always starts with a slow moral unravelling. People stop trusting each other. The bonds that hold society together start fraying thread by thread. Then comes the widening gap between those who have everything and those who have nothing, until the system buckles under its own weight. And then, almost always, some kind of catastrophe. A flood, a fire, a war, a collapse so total that what comes after barely resembles what came before. And then, after the destruction, something new. A reset. A renewal, a fresh age beginning from the ruins of the last one. That's the pattern. Moral decline, social fracture, catastrophe, and renewal. And you find it everywhere you look in the ancient world. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of topic where it's tempting to leap to dramatic conclusions. So let me be upfront about something. We are going to take a serious, grounded look at these traditions. We'll talk about what's historically documented, what scholars actually know about these calendars, and what's genuinely striking about the similarities. We'll also be honest about what's symbolic versus literal, what's theological storytelling versus encoded observation, and where the theories get speculative. Because some of what's been written about ancient world-age calendars is fascinating and credible. And some of it has been stretched way past what the evidence actually supports. We're going to know the difference. Here's the roadmap for what we're covering. First, we'll look at the core idea of cyclical time itself. Why so many ancient cultures saw history as circular rather than linear, and what that reveals about how they experience the world. Then we'll go through the major calendar systems one by one. The Indian Yuga cycle with its vast cosmic timescales, the Greek and Roman ages of humanity as Hesiod described them, the Mesoamerican Five Suns and the logic of world destruction and recreation, the Maya long count and what it actually says about turning points, the Zoroastrian world age tradition from ancient Persia, the biblical framework of ages and tribulation, and the Norse Ragnarok as a template for the idea of the Great Reset. After that, we zoom back out and look at the pattern itself. What are the specific markers that recur across all these traditions when an age is ending? We'll take each one seriously and ask whether they describe something real about how complex societies actually collapse, or whether they're just a story humans keep telling themselves because it feels meaningful. And finally, we'll talk about what any of this might mean for the world we're living in right now. Not in a panic, not in a hype cycle, but with genuine curiosity and a little intellectual honesty. Before we go any further though, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is there. Seriously, I read these and the geography of it is something I find genuinely fascinating. It's 3 in the afternoon in one city and 3 in the morning in another. And somehow we're all sitting with the same questions about ancient calendars and the ends of ages. Berlin at breakfast, Mumbai at midnight, São Paulo on a Sunday morning. Tell me where you are. I check comments and I love seeing it. Now back to the ancient calendars. Because the pattern we're talking about isn't just a coincidence of mythology. It might be something closer to a pattern of observation. Here's what I mean. These weren't idle storytellers making things up for entertainment. The people who built these calendar systems were, in many cases, among the most rigorous astronomers, mathematicians, and social observers of the ancient world. The Indian scholars who mapped the Yuga cycle were doing sophisticated astronomical calculation. The Maya long count is based on precise celestial mechanics. The Zoroastrian world-age framework is tied to a theological cosmology, yes, but also to serious observations about history and empire. So when multiple traditions independently arrive at the conclusion that ages end through the same sequence of events, moral decay followed by inequality, followed by catastrophe, followed by renewal, the question worth asking isn't just, is this mythology? The question is, were they observing something real about how human civilizations behave over long time spans? Were they encoding in symbolic form something they had actually watched happen more than once? Were the stories about floods and fires and collapsing ages actually compressed records of real collapses they had witnessed or inherited memory of? We don't know for certain. That's the honest answer. But the consistency across cultures is striking enough that serious historians and archaeologists have started asking exactly those questions. What we do know is this. Every civilization that built one of these world-age calendars eventually looked at the age they were living in and concluded they were near the end of it. The markers of decline, the fracturing of trust, the concentration of wealth and power, the sense that the old order was failing and something catastrophic was coming. Those markers showed up in ancient India, in ancient Greece, in Mesoamerica, in Persia, in the Norse world, again and again across thousands of years. And some people today look at those same markers and wonder if we're reading from the same page of the same very old book. That's what we're going to find out. Let's start with the calendar itself, and why the ancient world thought time was a circle. So what exactly is a world age? Because it's easy to conflate it with things that look similar, but aren't quite the same. A dynasty changes, an empire falls, an archaeological period ends when people switch from bronze tools to iron ones. Those are all ways of dividing history into chunks. But a world age is something fundamentally different, and the distinction matters. When ancient thinkers described a world age, they weren't just marking a change in who was in power or what material people made their weapons from. They were describing a change in the quality of existence itself, the moral fabric of the cosmos, the relationship between humans and the divine, the basic conditions under which life is possible. A world age isn't a chapter in a political history. It's a phase in the life cycle of reality. When one ends, something essential about the nature of the world shifts. Not just who's running things, what things are made of. That's a completely different claim than Rome fell or the Bronze Age ended. And it's the reason these traditions have survived thousands of years of intellectual revision, while dynasties and archaeological labels get reclassified every few decades. They're operating at a different level of abstraction, one that touches something deeper than politics or technology. Now, to understand why so many cultures built these systems, you have to understand the difference between two fundamentally incompatible ways of experiencing time. And I want to be careful here, because historians and philosophers have spent careers on this question, and it doesn't reduce neatly to a simple binary. But the broad contrast is real, and it matters. In a cyclical model of time, history doesn't go anywhere in particular. It returns. The seasons come back. The stars complete their circuits. Generations rise and fall and are replaced by generations that face the same essential challenges. What happened before will happen again, perhaps not in identical detail, but in recognizable pattern. The cosmos breathes in and breathes out. Ages follow one another the way years do, not as a climb toward something, but as a wheel turning through phases. This view of time wasn't primitive or unsophisticated. It was, in many cases, the conclusion of people who were watching the sky with extraordinary precision and noticing that everything they could observe moved in cycles. The sun, the moon, the planets, the seasons, the rise and fall of rivers. If you're an ancient Indian astronomer charting the movements of celestial bodies across generations, or a Maya mathematician calculating the interlocking gears of multiple calendar wheels, cyclical time isn't a metaphor. It's what you actually see when you pay close enough attention. Linear time, the idea that history has a direction, that it moves from a beginning through the present toward an endpoint that hasn't happened yet, is a different kind of claim. It implies purpose. It implies that something is being worked toward, that the present moment has a unique position in an unfolding story, rather than being one more turn of a wheel that has been turning forever. This model shows up most clearly in the Abrahamic traditions, where history moves from creation through fall through redemption toward a final judgment that closes the book for good. But it also appears in more complicated forms in Zoroastrianism and in certain strands of Greek thought. Here's what's genuinely interesting, though. These two models are not mutually exclusive, and many cultures held both simultaneously without apparent contradiction. The Indian Yuga system is cyclical at the cosmic scale. Ages repeat, one after another, within enormous cycles called kalpas. But within any given age, things are moving in a direction, declining from the perfection of the Satya Yuga toward the degradation of the Kali Yuga. So from the inside you experience linear time. Zoom out far enough and it's a wheel. That tension between the local experience of direction and the cosmic reality of recurrence is one of the most sophisticated features of these systems, and it's not an accident. It's a deliberate structure built to account for something real about how time actually feels from inside a human life. So why build these systems at all? What were they actually for? The honest answer is that they served several different functions simultaneously, and disentangling them is part of what makes this topic genuinely complicated, rather than just exotic. The most obvious function is moral teaching. If you're living in the final, most degraded age of a cosmic cycle, the implication is clear. The world is worse than it used to be. The golden era of perfect virtue and cosmic harmony is behind you, which means the direction of the culture should be backward, toward older values, older practices, older forms of restraint and duty, rather than forward toward novelty and ambition. World-age systems are, among other things, elaborate arguments for conservatism, for the recovery of something lost, rather than the invention of something new. That's a politically powerful idea, and you can trace its influence across every culture that developed one of these frameworks. The second function is political legitimacy. If the king or the priest or the ruling class can credibly claim a connection to the Golden Age, or can position themselves as the force that will prevent or delay the final catastrophe, that's an extraordinary source of authority. We see this across the ancient world. Roman emperors claimed to be inaugurating a new Golden Age. Indian rulers associated themselves with the righteous order of earlier Yugas. Mesoamerican rulers positioned a continuation of the current sun as dependent on ritual performances they controlled. World ages weren't just philosophy, they were political infrastructure. The third function is cosmic order. These systems gave people a map. They told you where you were in the largest possible story, what to expect, what the forces at work in history actually were, and what the endpoint looked like. That's not a trivial thing to offer. When everything around you seems to be fragmenting and the old certainties are collapsing, knowing that this is what the end of an age looks like, that it has happened before and that something comes after, is genuinely stabilizing. It transforms catastrophe from senseless destruction into meaningful transition. And the fourth function, the one that I think is most underappreciated, is social memory. These frameworks preserved in encoded form the collective experience of societies that had watched previous orders collapse. When a tradition says that an age ends in moral dissolution, followed by violence, followed by catastrophe, followed by a difficult renewal, it's quite possible that this sequence was drawn from actual observation, from real collapses that had been witnessed, survived, and remembered. The mythological packaging doesn't necessarily mean the underlying content is invented. It might mean the underlying content was too important to lose and too large for ordinary historical narrative to hold. Now, before we go any further, we need to clarify something that's going to come up in every tradition we examine. What exactly counts as an ending? Because the answer turns out to be different depending on which system you're looking at, and collapsing them all together is where a lot of loose thinking about this topic goes wrong. In some traditions, an age ends with a literal physical catastrophe, a flood, a fire, a destruction that is geologically real, or at least is meant to be understood that way. In others, the ending is primarily moral and spiritual. The age dies because human virtue has declined past a recoverable threshold, and the cosmos responds, but the response might be gradual rather than sudden. In others still, the ending is cosmic and political simultaneously. A regime change that is also a metaphysical reset, where the destruction of an old order is read as the closing of one age and the opening of another. What's consistent across traditions isn't the mechanism of ending. It's the sequence leading up to it, and that sequence is what we're actually going to be testing as we move through these systems. Does every tradition describe the same moral and social deterioration before the breaking point? Does every tradition end with something that functions as a purge, a clearing of the accumulated disorder before renewal becomes possible? And does renewal always look like a return to something older rather than an arrival at something new? Those are the questions, and the answer, as you'll see, is striking enough to warrant serious attention without requiring you to believe that any of these traditions was literally prophesying specific future events. Think of it less as a prediction system and more as a diagnostic framework. A set of recurring observations about how complex social orders tend to behave under pressure, wrapped in the symbolic language that each culture used to make those observations permanent and transmissible. Whether you treat the Indian Yuga cycle as theology, as astronomy, as social observation, or as all three at once, the pattern inside it is coherent and consistent. And when you stack it next to the Greek model, the Mesoamerican model, the Norse model, the Zoroastrian model, and the biblical model, something comes into focus that's harder to dismiss than any single tradition alone. That's what we're building toward. Let's start with the oldest and most precisely calculated of all of them, the ancient Indian system that divides all of cosmic time into 4 descending ages, and has been doing so for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. The Indian system starts with a simple, brutal claim: everything is getting worse. Not randomly worse, not chaotically worse, but predictably worse, according to a law as regular as the seasons. That law is called Dharma, usually translated as righteousness, duty, or cosmic order, but in this context you can think of it as the structural integrity of reality, the strength of truth-telling, promise-keeping, fair dealing, the degree to which the world supports virtue instead of punishing it. The ancient texts say Dharma stands on 4 legs, like a table. In the first age, the Satya Yuga, all 4 are intact. In the second Treta, 1 leg is knocked away. In Dvapara, a 3rd leg goes. And in the last age, Kali, Dharma is all but collapsed, wobbling on a single compromised support. The ages aren't just about more or less technology or empires rising and falling. They're about the gradual withdrawal of moral gravity from the universe. Satya Yuga, the Age of Truth, is the baseline. This is the Golden Age, not in some vague nostalgic sense, but in a highly specified moral and social configuration. The Puranas and Dharma texts describe a world where truth is effortless. People are naturally honest, generous, non-violent. There is no need for complex law codes because everyone spontaneously does what is right. Kingship exists, but it's almost redundant. The ruler is a perfectly righteous guardian who barely has to govern because society polices itself through shared virtue. Human lifespan in Satya is enormous. The numbers you see in classical sources are mythic, tens of thousands of years, but what matters is the relative scale. Lives are long, bodies are strong, memory is deep. Society is simple but ordered. Varna, the famous social division into priests, rulers, merchants and workers, exists more as functional differentiation than as rigid hierarchy. Everyone knows their role, and those roles are lived as expressions of inner nature, not as cages. Spiritual practice in Satya is direct, meditation, contemplation, immediate awareness of the divine. There's no crowd of competing sects, no anxious clinging to rituals. The gods are near, or perhaps more accurately, the boundary between human and divine perception is thin. If you're looking for a picture of how Indian tradition imagines the way things are supposed to be, Satya Yuga is it. Then the wheel turns. Treta Yuga begins when one leg of Dharma falls. In narrative terms, this is the age that contains the events of the Ramayana. Virtue is still strong, but it is no longer universal. The texts say that 3/4 of Dharma remains. That sounds reassuring, but it hides a crucial shift. Goodness must now be actively maintained. Kingship becomes serious business. Righteous rulers are still possible, but they have to work to hold things together. Governance takes on a heavier, more coercive tone. Punishment appears as a real tool. Lifespans shorten. Desire and ambition become more intense. Ritual sacrifice becomes the dominant spiritual technology. In Satya, people could simply know. In Treta, they must perform. The sheer volume of ritual detail in Vedic literature fits this age's flavour. A world where cosmic order still works, but it has to be constantly fed, maintained, negotiated with through offerings and precise practice. Social order thickens. The same 4 Varnas are present, but their boundaries harden. Lineage and birth begin to matter more. You see the seeds of the later caste logic forming. The idea that your station in life is determined by the accumulated moral residue of previous lives, and that disrupting that arrangement threatens the fragile balance that still remains. Another turn, another leg lost. Dvapara Yuga is the age of half Dharma, half disorder. This is the era of the Mahabharata, the great war on the field of Kurukshetra. The texts are explicit. In this age, confusion dominates. People still know what righteousness is supposed to look like, but it's contested, debated, selectively applied. Kingship is precarious. Rulers are powerful but often compromised, torn between duty and desire, clan loyalty and universal justice. Alliances fracture easily. Governance becomes an art of managing conflict rather than embodying a cosmic order everyone trusts. Human lifespans contract again. Health declines. Violence becomes common, not as a breakdown into total chaos, but as the normal background condition of politics. Spiritual life fragments. Devotion, ritual, and knowledge all coexist, but none of them dominates. The Bhagavad Gita, placed within this age, reads almost like an instruction manual for surviving a morally ambiguous world, how to act when every option is tainted. Socially, inequality deepens. The Varna system begins to splinter further, with subgroups and subranks proliferating. The ideal of everyone performing their proper duty persists, but in practice, duty is often used to justify entrenched privilege. Corruption is possible and increasingly common, and the texts know this. You start to see long lists of the sins of kings, of priests, of merchants, catalogues of ways the system can be abused. And finally, Kali Yuga, the age we are said in most traditional chronologies to be living in now. If Satya was effortless truth, Kali is normalized falsehood. Dharma is on one leg, and even that leg is shaky. The Puranas do not hold back. They describe a world where rulers are thieves, priests are hypocrites, friendship is transactional, and family bonds are thin. Wealth becomes the main criterion for status. Power, not virtue, decides what is considered right. Lifespans in the mythic ratios are a fraction of what they were. Bodies are weaker, diseases more frequent. The texts predict environmental degradation in a pre-modern idiom, rivers losing their sanctity, crops failing, animals shrinking in number and quality. Social boundaries both harden and dissolve in strange ways. Some traditions say caste distinctions will be overturned. Others say they'll be weaponized to extremes. What they agree on is that the overall pattern is confusion and contestation, not stable hierarchy. Spiritual practice in Kali is paradoxical. On the one hand, it is the hardest age in which to live a righteous life. Temptations are everywhere, distractions constant, institutions unreliable. On the other hand, some traditions call it the most spiritually efficient. A small act of virtue, a little genuine devotion is said to have enormous weight precisely because the surrounding conditions are so hostile. This is not an age of serene sages on mountaintops. It's an age of struggle where inner work is warfare. How do these ages actually end and begin? The boundaries aren't drawn as neat calendar flips. The texts talk instead in omens and sequences. A yuga ends when certain patterns become unmistakable. At the close of a dharmic age, you see the first cracks, rulers failing in their duties, justice applied unevenly, truth becoming negotiable. Trade becomes dishonest. Teachers take payment, but don't transmit real knowledge. Violence increases, not necessarily as total collapse, but as background noise. Eventually, the stories say, these trends reach a threshold where the existing order cannot be patched any further. Omens appear, comets, eclipses, strange planetary alignments, unseasonal weather, famine and epidemic. The Mahabharata frames the Kurukshetra war as exactly this kind of transition, a concentration of accumulated disorder that has to burn itself out. The line between metaphor and memory is blurry here, and the texts don't feel compelled to separate them. Cosmic signs and social breakdown are part of one intertwined pattern. The end of Yuga motif almost always combines moral and physical crisis. As Dharma declines, the world itself becomes unstable. Then comes a purge, war, flood, fire, or a long grinding series of calamities followed, eventually, by restoration. The cycle doesn't just spiral downward forever. At the bottom, something resets. A new Satya dawns. Dharma stands on four legs again. The wheel turns, but the pattern inside it stays the same. Now, what about the timescales? Classical Puranic chronology assigns astonishing numbers to these ages, hundreds of thousands of years for each yuga, with a full cycle running into the millions, nested inside even vaster cosmic days and nights of Brahma. If you take those numbers literally, we are only a tiny fraction into the current Kali Yuga, which itself began several thousand years ago. But Indian thinkers have never agreed unanimously on how to read these figures. Some commentators treat them as exact cosmic durations tied to astronomical cycles. Others compress them, arguing that the huge numbers are symbolic magnifications, or that the yugas can operate on multiple nested levels, cosmic, historical, and individual. In modern times, New Age and esoteric interpretations have tried to map the Yugas onto precession cycles, or known historical periods, often by radically shrinking the traditional timescales. What's striking isn't the agreement on dates. There isn't any. It's the agreement on structure. However you scale it, the same architecture survives, a descent from full dharma to near-total disorder, with each age characterized by specific shifts in virtue, governance, lifespan, and social order, marked off by recognizable symptoms of breakdown, and culminating in a crisis that clears the ground for renewal. Treat the numbers as literal and you're looking at a grand astronomical clock. Read them allegorically, and you're holding a psychological and sociological map of how civilizations corrode over time. Either way, the Indian Yuga cycle gives us a detailed picture of what an age looks like from the inside as it moves toward its end. And that picture, as we'll see when we turn to Greece, Rome and beyond, is far from unique. So what, exactly, tips an age over the edge? In the Yuga framework, it's not a single comet, a single war, or a single evil king. It's a long accumulation of hairline fractures that suddenly connect. The myths zoom in less on one final bang and more on a pattern of endings that always looks eerily similar. The first part of that pattern is institutional rot. In earlier ages, institutions, kingship, priesthood, family trade are imagined as mostly aligned with dharma. They may be imperfect, but they're aiming in roughly the right direction. By the end of an age, that alignment snaps. The very structures created to protect people start extracting from them. Texts like the Vishnu Purana paint an almost obsessive picture of this drift. Kings who were once guardians of justice become raiders in royal clothing. They overtax, confiscate, and wage constant petty wars, not to uphold order but to satisfy appetite. Priests who were once custodians of sacred knowledge start selling rituals like commodities, performing ceremonies without belief, trading authority for bribes. Merchants manipulate weights and measures, push shoddy goods, corner markets. Householders treat family as a burden rather than a duty. It's not that everyone suddenly turns into a comic book villain. It's that the baseline expectation shifts. You expect rulers to lie. You expect holy men to be hypocrites. You expect contracts to be broken unless backed by force. Trust becomes an exception instead of the rule. Alongside this, you get a second theme: conflict as the default setting. At the end of a yuga, the stories say quarrel and hostility become the atmosphere people breathe. Not only between kingdoms, but inside every relationship. Teacher versus student, parent versus child, neighbour versus neighbour. Every tie that once carried obligations of respect and care becomes negotiable, contingent, easily severed. The texts describe a world where people cling to groups for identity, but betray those same groups for short-term gain. Clan, caste, sect, party all become tools in zero-sum games. Law doesn't disappear, it multiplies, but in a way that confuses rather than clarifies. Legal codes get longer, interpretations more self-serving. Cases drag on, justice is selectively applied, and ordinary people learn to assume that outcomes are bought, not earned. Out of this stew comes the third ingredient of an ending: loss of shared meaning. In Satya and Treta, there is at least an agreed picture of what a good life looks like. By late Dvapara and deep into Kali, that picture disintegrates. Competing value systems proliferate. The same words, dharma, duty, truth, are used, but they refer to incompatible visions. Ancient Indian authors frame this as a kind of moral vertigo. People no longer trust their own judgment. They imitate whatever seems successful. Wealth, speed, novelty, and pleasure become default measures of worth, because the older measures, honour, lineage, reputation for fairness, feel hollow or weaponized. The result isn't an enlightened pluralism, It's a sense that nothing solid exists to stand on. This is where that image of Dharma's legs really bites. On the surface, it's simple. In each age, Dharma loses one leg, like a cow or a table getting steadily less stable until it's balancing awkwardly on one. But think about what that implies psychologically and socially. A four-legged table can take a hit. If one corner is overloaded, the others compensate. In Satya, you can have individual failures, corrupt people, bad decisions, and the system absorbs them. The shared norms are strong enough to correct or isolate the damage. As the legs go, you lose redundancy. In Treta, a big enough failure shakes the whole structure. In Dvapara, the table is already wobbling. Every choice feels risky. By Kali, there is no margin. One more push in the wrong direction and the whole thing tips. Socially, that's the experience of living without buffers. No robust safety nets, moral or material. If your king fails, there's no higher legitimacy to appeal to. If your teacher fails, there's no broader culture of integrity to fall back on. Every institution is suspect, every authority contingent. Psychologically, the one-leg-left age produces a particular kind of anxiety. People feel the instability, but don't agree on the cause. Some cling harder to old rules, others abandon them completely. Some become cynical, everyone is corrupt, why pretend otherwise? Others become fanatical, only my tiny group preserves real Dharma. The sense that the world is off-kilter becomes part of daily consciousness. In that context, the stories introduce one more motif, the reset. In the classical Vaishnava telling, Kali Yuga doesn't simply decay into infinite greyness. Near its end, when Dharma has almost completely fallen, a figure appears, Kalki, the final avatar of Vishnu. The Puranas describe him in vivid, often violent terms, mounted on a white horse, wielding a blazing sword, cutting down the wicked, burning out accumulated corruption. After this purgation, the texts say, a new Satya Yuga begins. Dharma's four legs return, the cycle restarts. Taken literally, that's a prophecy of a future divine intervention. Taken as mythic language, it's a pattern recognition device. Kalki embodies the idea that systems don't reform gently once they've passed certain thresholds. They reset through rupture. When incremental fixes fail, when corruption is too deep to be surgically removed, you get something closer to amputation, a revolutionary moment, a founding violence that clears space for a new order. In that sense, the Kalki story is less about one supernatural saviour, and more about a recurring historical reality. Periods when concentrated force, moral or military or both, tears through a decayed structure and refounds the norms. New laws, new rulers, new sacred stories, often justified as restoring the true Dharma, even when the details look very different from what came before. This is where it's tempting to start mapping Yuga endings onto real-world cycles. You don't have to believe in literal million-year Yugas to notice that complex societies often move through recognizable arcs. Periods of relative balance, moderate inequality, widely shared belief in basic norms, institutions that mostly work, give way over time to concentration of wealth and power. As elites pull away from everyone else, trust erodes. Rules get bent or rewritten. Ordinary people experience the system as rigged. At the same time, environmental pressures pile up. In pre-modern terms, that might be deforestation, soil exhaustion, over-irrigation or over-hunting. In contemporary terms, it might be climate change, mass extinction, resource depletion. Either way, the support systems that quietly kept life possible start to wobble. When inequality, ecological strain, and institutional corruption converge, you tend to see legitimacy collapse. Governments lose the ability to convince people that their rulings are fair. Religions fracture or lose moral authority. The stories that once made sacrifice, obedience, and patience feel meaningful stop working. What follows historically is often a spike in violence, rebellions, civil wars, invasions, purges. It's easy to look at this and say, that's Kali Yuga ending right there. But it's important to keep the framing honest. These are parallels, not proofs. The Yuga model isn't a data-driven sociological law. It's an ancient attempt to compress messy cyclical patterns into a single memorable narrative. And that narrative is sticky for a reason. First, it makes chaos intelligible. If you're living through a time when institutions are failing, corruption is normal, and basic trust is hard to come by, the feeling is disorienting and frightening. The Yuga story says this isn't random. It's a phase. Ages ripen, decay, and die like living things. That doesn't remove the pain, but it gives it context. Your suffering is part of a known pattern. Second, it offers a moral diagnosis. Instead of saying history is just one damn thing after another, the Yuga framework tells you what's going wrong, not just bad weather or unlucky wars, but a fundamental thinning of dharma, a loss of honesty, duty, and shared meaning. That kind of diagnosis is powerful because it connects individual choices to cosmic consequences. Your small acts of integrity or deceit matter, not only for you but for the shape of the age. Third, and maybe most importantly, it promises restoration. Without Kalki or whatever name a tradition gives to the reset force, the story would be unbearable, ever-deepening decline with no way out. By ending each cycle with renewal, the Yuga model gives people a reason not to collapse into pure despair or pure nihilism. Yes, things fall apart. Yes, dark times are real, but the wheel also turns back toward light. Even if you won't live to see the new Satya Yuga, your actions can be aligned with it. You can live as a citizen of the coming order inside the crumbling one. That combination, pattern, diagnosis, and promise, is why age-ending myths travel so easily across cultures. They don't have to be literally correct in every detail to feel true enough to hold on to. And as we move from India to Greece, Rome, Mesoamerica, Persia, and beyond, we'll see the same basic template repeating. A golden order declining into corruption and confusion, a period of mounting crisis, and a final rupture that clears the ground for something new. Different gods, different timelines, different symbols. But the same intuition, ages don't end quietly. They end when the legs under reality finally give way. If you jump from India to early Greece, the scenery changes, the gods change, the timelines shrink dramatically. But the emotional weather at the end of an age, weirdly familiar. One of the first people we know of in Greece to lay out a full-blown world ages theory is Hesiod, a poet working around the 8th century BCE. He wasn't a court intellectual or a philosopher in an ivory tower. He was a small farmer who also happened to be very good at complaining in verse. And his complaints become the backbone of the Greek age of the world story. He lays out 5 ages of humans: gold, silver, bronze, the age of heroes, and iron. If the Indian Yugas give you a cosmic clock measured in millions of years, Hesiod gives you something more like a bitter family history. The Golden Age, he says, was when people lived like gods. Not because they had advanced tech, but because they didn't need it. The earth gave freely. There was no hard labour, no old age grinding you down. People just existed in a kind of effortless prosperity and mutual ease until they died gently, like being lulled to sleep. Already you can see the metric he's using. He doesn't talk about tools, cities, or inventions. He talks about how it feels to live in a particular time. Is life heavy or light? Is work backbreaking or easy? Is there fear, conflict, exploitation? For Hesiod, an age is basically a mood, a moral and social atmosphere. Then comes the Silver Age, and the tone shifts. People live longer as children, never growing up, then become arrogant and neglect the gods. They don't practice justice, don't offer proper respect. Zeus wipes them out. The decline here isn't about losing technology, it's about losing piety and proper order. The cosmos is imagined as a hierarchy. When humans stop playing their role, the whole age is judged and removed. The Bronze Age is worse. Hesiod describes these people as terrifying and strong, obsessed with war. Their homes, their tools, even their hearts are bronze in the sense of being hard, unyielding. They spend their time fighting and finally destroy themselves. Civilization, in any humanistic sense, barely registers here. It's an age defined by armour and violence, not by law or wisdom. Then, briefly, there's a detour. The Age of Heroes, Hesiod's fourth age, isn't part of a simple downward slide. It's a kind of upward flicker. These are the legendary figures of Greek myth, those who fought at Thebes and Troy, people like Achilles and Odysseus. They're better than the bronze people, nobler, more just, more admirable, even if they're still violent. After death, some of them get to live on in the Isles of the Blessed, a quieter echo of the old golden ease. So already you can see this isn't a perfectly smooth decline. It has a brief rally. It's like the Yuga cycle if you inserted a little mini Satya Yuga spike near the bottom, one last generation that still remembers what real greatness looked like. And then there's the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time. Our time as far as his myth is concerned. This is the one that really matters for our pattern. In the Iron Age, people work constantly. Labour is relentless. There is no free abundance. Everything is hard won. But the core of the problem isn't just economic, it's moral. He says children dishonour their parents, guests are not respected. Oaths are broken. Justice herself, personified as a goddess, is abused and driven out of the city, weeping. The strong prey on the weak. Envy stalks the streets, rejoicing in the misfortune of neighbours. People feel shame less and less, and what scruples they still have get overridden by greed. Sound familiar? In Indian terms, this is what it looks like when Dharma is down to one leg. In Hesiod's terms, it's what it feels like when you live in the last, worst age. You can't rely on people to keep their word. You can't trust institutions to enforce fairness. Even the gods seem far away, watching but not intervening. Again, notice what's doing the measuring here. It's not metal technology. Historically, iron was actually an upgrade from bronze, more flexible, more available. In a material sense, the Iron Age Greeks knew real improvements, better tools, larger settlements, more complex trade networks. But in the myth, iron doesn't mean technological progress. It means spiritual heaviness. For Hesiod, an age is defined by character. By what kind of human being the time period tends to produce. Golden humans are effortlessly just. Silver ones are childish and impious. Bronze ones are brutal and warlike. Heroic ones are glorious but tragic. Iron humans are anxious, greedy, litigious, and exhausted. The errors are moral climates, not archaeological layers. That's why his Iron Age feels like an ending, even though materially Greece is just getting started. He literally says he wishes he had died before or been born later, anything but having to live in this degraded now. He imagines a future within the Iron Age, when even the remaining decencies will vanish, when every social bond will be transacted, every trust devoured. In other words, he sees his own society on a slope, not yet at the very bottom, but sliding. And he frames that slope as the end of a world. Later Greek and Roman writers pick up this template and repurpose it for their own crises. By the time you get to the Roman poet Ovid, writing his Metamorphoses under Augustus, the four-metal sequence, gold, silver, bronze, iron, has become standard cultural shorthand. Ovid retells the ages as a more polished myth. Golden people live in peace without laws. Silver brings seasons and agriculture and the need for shelter. Bronze is more aggressive. Iron is outright criminal, inventing ships to cross seas, mining the earth for metals, building weapons and walls. Ovid lives in an empire that has just come out of brutal civil wars. He's watching a new regime consolidate power, watching old republican institutions bend or break. When he describes the Iron Age as a time when honesty, shame and faith are gone, when war is everywhere and land is divided into private property with boundary stones, he's not just copying Hesiod, he's diagnosing his own present through a mythic lens. Roman moralists do this constantly. When they complain that we are living in an age of iron while our ancestors were closer to gold, they're rarely talking about actual metallurgy. They're talking about perceived decline in courage, simplicity, public virtue. Sometimes they even invert the sequence. A few Stoic-influenced writers, for example, will argue that early ages were brutish and lawless, and that progress in law and philosophy has made later times better, not worse. But they still use age language. They still frame history as passing through recognizable phases defined by the quality of human life, not just by gadgets or conquests. And during real crises, plagues, civil wars, barbarian invasions, you can almost watch the Age of Decline narrative harden. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century CE as the Western Empire phrase, looks back nostalgically at earlier emperors as if they belonged to a better, purer time. Augustine, reacting to the sack of Rome in 410, leans into a different but related template. The earthly city is always decaying. Only the city of God is truly stable. The language isn't literally Hesiod's, but the emotional structure is the same. We've left something better behind, and what we live in now feels like the world ending. So how does this map onto the Yuga system? Carefully. Both frameworks imagine a long descent from an original harmony into a contentious, trust-poor present. Both focus heavily on moral decline, injustice, broken oaths, corruption, loss of shame. Both see the end of an age as a time when basic social glue stops working, when you can no longer assume good faith from rulers, priests, or neighbours. But the metaphysics are different. In the Indian Yugas, the decline is baked into the structure of the cosmos. It's cyclical, predictable, grounded in a vast moral physics where Dharma's legs necessarily shorten over time and then are restored by divine intervention. The ages keep looping. Satya, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, then back again. In Hesiod, the logic of decline feels more like a lament than a law. There's no explicit cosmic guarantee that after iron comes a new golden reset. He hints that Zeus might finally destroy even this age when it crosses certain lines, but he doesn't spell out a clean cycle. His scheme is more linear and more personal. The gods made better humans once, then worse ones, and now we're stuck at the bottom, hoping it doesn't get even worse. Later, Greco-Roman thinkers sometimes flirt with cycles, talking about recurring floods and fires, or the great year in which the stars return to their positions. But the basic ages story remains morally driven, not astronomically timed. It's a way of saying, look at what kind of people we've become, not here's the exact cosmic calendar. Still, when you strip away the different gods and the different metaphysics, a shared intuition remains. Whether you call it Kali Yuga or the Age of Iron, there's a felt pattern, a world where conflict is normal, trust is rare, institutions feel rigged, and older stories of virtue sound naive. A world that seems to be running on fumes, and across civilizations, that feeling, the sense that you're living in the last worst chapter, is exactly what invites people to imagine resets, new suns, final battles, and world-renewing fires. Which is where we go next to another culture that took world ages and endings very, very literally. If you cross the ocean and fast forward more than 2,000 years, you find another civilization obsessed with world ages and endings. But this time, the The stakes aren't just moral, they're physical, astronomical, and terrifyingly concrete. For the Aztec, or more precisely, the Mexica and their neighbours in central Mexico, the world you and I live in is not the first version. It's the fifth, they called them suns. Not in the casual poetic way we might say, under the same sun, but as literal eras of cosmic stability, each with its own sky, its own dominant forces, and its own built-in expiration date. You're not just living in history, you're living under the fifth sun, and that label already hints that 4 entire worlds have gone before, each one destroyed in its own special way. Different sources give slightly different sequences. This is mythology, not an engineering manual, but one common version goes like this. The first sun is sometimes called 4 Jaguar. In this world, the gods create a race of giant humans. They're strong, but they're not quite right. They don't follow the proper order. They don't sustain the balance between heaven and earth. So the gods let the experiment crash. Jaguars descend and devour the people. The world ends in teeth and darkness. The second sun, 4 Wind, is a do-over. New humans, new era. But again, something in their way of life doesn't line up with cosmic expectations. This time the destruction comes as hurricanes, sky-ripping winds that scour the earth. Humans are blown away, transformed into monkeys, clinging to trees in a world that's been reset back to something more primitive. Third sun, 4 Rain. Not the gentle agricultural rain that feeds maize, but a storm of fire. A rain of flaming stones, burning resin, something like volcanic ash imagined at mythic scale. The people of this age are destroyed in a catastrophe that flips the element script completely. It's not water but fire that falls from the sky. The survivors become birds. Fourth sun. 4 Water. You can probably guess this one. This world ends in a giant flood, the water rising until everything is submerged. Those who remain are transformed into fish. Another total reset, another obliteration of the old order. And then, last of all, our era, the fifth sun, usually named 4 Movement. That name is a warning label. The prophecy attached to it is stark. This world will end too, not by jaguars or wind or fiery rain or flood, but by movement, by earthquakes, by the shaking of the earth, possibly accompanied by a catastrophic darkness when the sun itself fails. Notice how different this feels from Hesiod's moral melancholy or the Indian sense of Dharma slowly draining away. The Mexica agree that worlds end, that ages are finite. But they imagine endings as specific physical events with specific signatures. Each age gets its own boss battle, and the variety isn't just storytelling flair. It encodes a logic. If you live in a landscape where volcanoes erupt, lakes flood, droughts cut off crops, and earthquakes periodically wipe out cities, you learn pretty quickly that there isn't one single kind of vulnerability. Nature can kill you in more ways than you can count. So a myth system that says, sometimes the universe ends in fire, sometimes in water, sometimes in beasts and hunger and shaking ground, is really saying, don't get too comfortable. Balance is fragile on multiple fronts. In that sense, the 5 suns are like a risk map of Mesoamerica, painted as cosmic history. Each destruction dramatizes a different axis of instability. Predators, storms, volcanic fire, flood, seismic collapse. You can't game the system by over-preparing for just one. You're always exposed somewhere. But here's the twist. For the Mexica, this vulnerability isn't an invitation to fatalism. It's a call to maintenance, because in their view, the 5th sun doesn't just run on its own until the fuel runs out. It has to be fed. This is where timekeeping stops being a neutral calendar and becomes a set of cosmic obligations. The Aztec ritual calendar, the 260-day tonal pohuale, and the 365-day solar year, the Xupohuale, weren't just clever agrarian tools. They were schedules for world maintenance. They told you when to plant and harvest, yes, but also when to sacrifice, when to fast, when to perform the exact rites that kept the sun moving and the sky from falling. The logic goes something like this. The gods sacrificed themselves to set this fifth sun in motion. They bled, burned and died so that humans could live in a lit world instead of eternal night. In return, humans owe a debt, not a metaphorical one, a literal running tab of energy, human blood, hearts, incense, offerings. These are payments on the cosmic mortgage. If you stop paying, the sun stops rising. The age ends early. From the outside, this looks brutal and alien, but inside the system, it's a kind of cosmic contract. The universe is not a clock you wind once and forget. It's a partnership that requires constant reinforcement. Calendars track not just days, but duties. Miss enough of them, and you risk sliding into the next destruction event. The famous new fire ceremony every 52 years is a perfect example. The 260-day and 365-day cycles line up again after 18,980 days, about 52 solar years. That rollover was a moment of existential dread. Every time it happened, people weren't sure the sun would agree to rise into yet another 52-year bundle. So they extinguished all fires, watched the Pleiades cross the sky, and lit a new sacred fire in a sacrificial victim's chest. Then they carried this flame out to relight every hearth in the empire. From a modern point of view, this is an astronomical synchronization ritual. From their point of view, it was more like renewing the lease on the fifth sun. Without it, the age might simply stop. Compare that to Hesiod or the Kali Yuga idea. In Greece, you can lament that you're in the Iron Age, but you don't have a button to push to restart the Golden One. In Indian cosmology, the Yuga cycle is so large and law-driven that individual human action can't halt or reverse it. At best, you align yourself morally with the coming renewal. In central Mexico, the picture is more nerve-wracking. The age is precarious, and you're part of the weight holding it up. Sacrifices, festivals, calendar accuracy, they're not background noise. They're structural beams. That's also why end-of-world talk in this system doesn't mean what it often means in modern popular culture. When a Mexica priest says the world will end in earthquakes and sun death, he doesn't mean a Marvel-style final curtain where physics shuts down and that's that. He means this configuration of gods, humans, and natural order will collapse, and another one will take its place. Just as Jaguar World gave way to Wind World, and Flood World yielded to ours, an Earthquake World will follow. Endings here are resets. They are brutal, yes, and total from the perspective of those living through them. But they're also part of a longer pattern in which creation and destruction are inseparable. The gods build, break, and rebuild. Humans participate, willingly or not, in that ongoing experiment. There's another wrinkle, though, and it's important if we're being careful with sources. Almost everything we know in detail about the Five Suns comes from codices and chroniclers writing after the Spanish conquest, people like Bernardino de Sahagún, or native and mestizo authors working under colonial rule. They're recording myths that were very likely told for centuries before, but those myths are now being explained to Christian friars, written down with European metaphors, sometimes merged with or filtered through Christian end-of-the-world language. So when we talk about the exact number of suns, their names, the sequence of destructions, we're dealing with a mixture, pre-contact traditions, local variations, political spin from the Aztec state religion, and post-conquest reinterpretation. Some scholars think the Five Suns schema may have been standardized relatively late, even used to legitimize Mexica power by positioning them as the chosen custodians of the final age. Even so, the core pattern keeps shining through. Multiple created worlds, multiple modes of destruction, a current age that exists under threat of another reset. A set of ritual obligations tied to a hyper-precise calendar, all aimed at delaying that reset as long as possible. Put next to Hesiod's melancholy about living in the age of iron, or India's vast Yuga clock, the Mexica vision adds a new dimension to our pattern. Here, the end of an age isn't just a moral judgment or a cosmic timing mechanism, it's an ongoing negotiation. The world is always ending, just very slowly, and only the right combination of sacrifice, balance, and attention can keep the sun moving across the sky one more day. Which brings us naturally to another Mesoamerican system that people love to misunderstand, a calendar that went viral in 2012 as a supposed doomsday clock, but that, in its own way, is less about sudden apocalypse and more about carefully tracking turning points. The Maya Long Count. If you were alive in December 2012, you probably remember the headlines. Mayan calendar predicts end of the world. Ancient prophecy says time runs out. People stocking up on supplies, documentaries milking the countdown, memes about partying like there's no tomorrow. And then December 21st showed up. Nothing happened. Airports stayed open. Wi-Fi stayed on. The sun rose on the 22nd like it had somewhere better to be. From our point of view, it looked like the Maya had just been wrong. Or maybe that the whole thing was modern nonsense, pasted onto an ancient system that never said apocalypse in the first place. To understand what actually flipped over in 2012, you have to understand what the long count is and what it isn't. The Maya didn't just have one calendar, they had a stacked set of interlocking cycles, a 260-day sacred count similar to the Aztec Tonalpohualli, a 365-day solar year. Then, sitting underneath those like bedrock, the long count. A way to keep track of days across centuries and mythic history without losing count. Think of the long count as a base 20 and base 18 odometer for time. The smallest unit is a kin, 1 day. 20 kin make 1 uinal, 20 days. 18 uinile, 360 days, make 1 ton, roughly a year. 20 ton, about 19.7 of our years, make a katoon. 20 katoon, just under 400 years, make a bektoon. Now stitch it together. A date like 13.000 in the long count means 13 bekatoons, 0 katoons, 0 tons, 0 uinals, 0 kin since a distant starting point. That starting point, when you convert it to our system, lands around August 11th or 13th, 3114 BCE, depending on which correlation you use, a mythic creation date for the current world order. So what was December 21st, 2012? It was the moment when the long count rolled from 12/19/1917/19 to 13.0.0.0, a big, clean odometer click. The end of a Bekton 12 period, and the beginning of Bekton 13. If you've ever watched your car roll over from 99,999 to 100,000 miles, you already understand the vibe. It's not the engine explodes at 100k, it's, oh, we just hit a major milestone now. Did the Maya think in miles and odometers? No, but they did think in completed cycles, in inscriptions, especially from the classic period. Certain completions, tun endings, katun endings, baktun endings are marked and celebrated. Rulers carve monuments that say, in effect, on this date, this period ends, and I, so-and-so, performed this ritual, took this title, dedicated this temple. In that sense, a turnover isn't just a number ticking over. It's a station in time. A scheduled stop where you get out, do something important, and then get back on the train. What the modern 2012 hype machine did was take one of those stations and inflate it into a terminal station. Final stop, everybody off, universe closed for renovations. Most Maya scholars don't see any support for that in the texts we have. There isn't a carved stone in Palenque that says, on the 13th Baktoon, skies fall, mountains melt, Good luck, everyone. Instead, we see something more like this. Dates that project far beyond 2012, references to events thousands of years in the future. Like at Palenque, where an inscription mentions an anniversary in the 80th Baktun. That's millions of days out. In other words, the system doesn't hit a cosmic wall at 13.0.0.0. You can keep counting. 14.0.0.0.0, 15.0.0, and so on. Just like you can keep driving past 100,000 miles. So where did the end of the world reading come from? Partly from us. We carry a very particular idea of final endings, judgment days, singular apocalypses, countdown clocks to zero. We see any ancient calendar with a big turnover and we project that drama onto it. There are debates about one key inscription, the so-called Tortuguero Monument 6 from Tabasco. It mentions the 13th Baktun and a deity descending. Some have argued this hints at a world-scale shift. Others read it as a perfectly standard note. On that future station in time, this god's presence will be celebrated. No fireballs required. Even in the middle of that interpretive fog, a broad consensus has emerged. Nothing in the Maya record clearly describes 13.00 as a hard stop, a total annihilation of the cosmos. It's marked as significant. It is not framed as game over, but not apocalypse doesn't mean not important. For the Maya, time was not a blank ruler you slide events along. Time had texture. Certain days were good for treaties, bad for war, favourable for planting, dangerous for travel. That logic scales up. If particular days and months have qualities, then so do Katun endings and Baktun completions. These bigger stations became perfect moments for politics and ritual. If you're a classic Maya king in the 8th century and a Katun ending is approaching, you've got options. You can line up a big building dedication so that it falls exactly on that turnover. You can stage a royal accession. Look, I take the throne right as a great cycle closes and a new one opens. You can time a war victory or a diplomatic alliance so that its memory is fused to that station in the calendar. On the stone, it looks like destiny. Time itself has endorsed your reign. That's the deeper function of calendar cycles here. They aren't just cosmic clocks ticking away in the background. They are frameworks you can plug human meaning into. They tell you when the universe is especially listening, when actions resonate at a higher volume. So a Baktun completion like the one that fell in 2012 is exactly the kind of date that would have attracted major rituals if classic Maya polities had still been thriving to perform them. Fire ceremonies, offerings, possibly royal reenactments of creation myths, tying the present ruler back to that original 3114 BCE moment. From that point of view, what should have happened in 2012 wasn't an asteroid. It was a party, a tense, serious party maybe, but still a ritual of renewal, not a funeral for the universe. Notice how this loops us back to the larger pattern we've been tracking. Endings, whether they're called Yuga transitions, ages of iron collapsing, the death of a sun, or the completion of a Baktun, naturally attract stories. Humans don't like blank transitions. We want to know what a threshold means. So even in a system where the calendar can just keep cycling like the Maya long count, big completions are magnets for end-of-age thinking. Sometimes that thinking runs catastrophic. At the next great rollover, everything burns. Sometimes it runs symbolic. At the next great rollover, power changes hands, gods shift roles. Our community must ritually reboot its relationship to the cosmos. Often it's both at once. We can see this in the Maya world itself. Many classic texts link period endings with acts of seating or tying the time. The verb glyphs suggest binding, enthroning, fixing a moment into order. If time is a series of seats on which gods and rulers rest, then station points are when you swap who's sitting there. That swap can be orderly or chaotic, auspicious or ominous, but it's not necessarily annihilating. In that sense, the long count gives us a crucial nuance for our whole video's thesis. Not every end of an age is imagined as jaguars flooding the streets or an iron sky collapsing. Sometimes it's imagined as a hinge, a pivot where the story can change direction without the stage itself being demolished. Modern 2012 fever missed that. We grabbed one spectacular pivot and forced it into our favourite template, total, final collapse. But the Maya lived with a more layered sense of time. You can have endings inside continuities, you can hit a huge cyclical milestone, mark it with sacrifices and coronations and cosmic speeches, and then move on. Same sky, new chapter. That doesn't make the ending trivial. It makes it structural, and once you see that, you can start to notice how often human societies use big calendar stations this way, not just in Mesoamerica, but in Persia, in Second Temple Judaism, in Norse myth. The cosmos doesn't always have to blow up for people to feel like they've passed from one age into another. Sometimes a symbolic reset is enough, which sets us up for the next turn in our journey, a tradition that does something very different with its world ages. Instead of purely rhythmic cycles or endlessly repeating suns, it offers a long, linear struggle with a defined finish line, one last turnover after which the game board itself is remade. Shift scenes in your head now from jungle temples and stone calendars to high plateaus, fire altars, and a very different way of thinking about time. If the Maya long count feels like a cosmic odometer, Zoroastrian time feels more like a war plan. In the tradition that grows out of ancient Iran, history isn't an endless loop of ages repeating forever. It's a long, finite campaign with a start date, defined phases, and a promised final renovation of reality itself, a moment the texts later call Frashokereti. In rough outline, the story goes like this. At the beginning, there is a good creator, Ahura Mazda, wise lord. He creates a perfect spiritual world and then a good material world. Depending on which text you read and when it was written, this act of creation is mapped onto a grid of time, often 12,000 years, sometimes divided into 4 blocks of 3,000. For the first phase, the world exists in spiritual form only. Think of it as the blueprint, the unfallen version of everything. Then comes embodiment, the second 3,000-year block, when the good creation becomes material, sky, waters, earth, plants, animals, the first human, the first bull. Everything is still aligned with truth, which in Zoroastrian terms is Asher, the cosmic order. But there's a problem. This isn't a monologue, it's a duel. Opposed to Ahura Mazda is Angra Mainyu, often called Ahriman in later texts. He's not just a bad god in the way we might think of a troublesome deity. He's a principle of destructive hostility, the personification of what the tradition calls Dru, lie, deception, distortion. According to one influential version of the story, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu make a kind of time-bound pact. The evil spirit cannot bear to exist in a state of endless stalemate. So when he attacks, Ahura Mazda fixes the duration of their struggle, a set number of millennia. Within that span, conflict will rage. At the end of it, truth wins permanently. So history becomes the arena where their strategies play out. In the third block of time, evil breaks into the good creation. Death appears. Disease appears, predatory animals, poisonous plants, winter, decay. These are framed not as neutral facts of nature, but as the footprint of a hostile mind in the fabric of the world. Humanity in this scheme is not just another species caught in the crossfire. It's a combatant. Zarathustra, Zoroaster, enters here, in what many sources treat as the beginning of the final phase. He's not a generic wise man reporting on cosmic events from the sidelines. In the oldest hymns attributed to him, the Gathas, he's speaking directly into this battlefield, urging people to choose Asher over Druge, truth over lie, constructive thought over destructive. And this is where Zoroastrian time gets its particular flavour. Every choice, every act, every word is loaded. You're not just being a decent or a lousy person in a vague moral sense. You're arming one side or the other in a cosmic war. Reciting prayers, telling the truth, tending the sacred fire. All of that is literally strengthening the forces of order. Lying, polluting, breaking contracts, mistreating the dead. Those are not private sins. They are tactical victories for Angra Mainyu. That moral dualism shapes how the end of the age is imagined. We've already seen cyclical traditions where ages naturally get worse. The Indian Yugas running down from Satya to Kali, the Greek metals decaying from gold to iron, Mesoamerican suns rising and falling. In those systems, decline is almost baked into the mechanics of time itself. The cosmos breathes in, breathes out, repeats. Zoroastrianism is doing something slightly different. Here, the overall arc of the world is not a circle. It's a line with a set terminus. What cycles is not the universe itself, but the intensity and visibility of the conflict inside it. As the final phase of history unfolds, texts describe a world where Angra Mainyu's influence becomes more and more blatant. Rulers become unjust. Families turn on each other. Contracts are broken. The deadliest weapons are unleashed. Famine, war, and chaos spread. Later, Middle Persian writings talk about a sequence of future saviour figures called Seoshyants, benefactors, who appear in the last millennia. Each one helps push the world closer to the tipping point where Frashocoreti can happen. In some tellings, the last of these is born miraculously from the preserved seed of Zarathustra himself, conceived by a virgin bathing in a sacred lake. The battle narrows to its sharpest point. The end markers, in other words, look very familiar. You get intensifying conflict, social fragmentation, deception becoming the default mode of politics and everyday life, religion corrupted, natural order warped. Even the very elements, earth, water, air, fire, are said to be more polluted and oppressed by evil at the close of the age than they were at the beginning. But here's the twist in Zoroastrian thought, that escalation is actually the prelude to healing, not proof that the whole game is rigged toward collapse. Because the finish line is not total obliteration. It's renovation. Frashocoreti literally means something like making wonderful again, making fresh. It's not a brand new creation out of nothing. It's the existing creation, cleansed, healed, and brought back into full alignment with Asher. Different texts describe the big moment in vivid, sometimes unsettling imagery. One famous scene imagines all humanity passing through a river of molten metal. For the righteous, it feels like walking through warm milk. For the wicked, it burns. But that burning is purgative, not purely punitive. Evil is separated out, burnt away, rendered powerless. After this cosmic smelting, the metals cool, the earth becomes perfectly flat and fertile again, and physical existence is now incorruptible. People eat without killing, bodies don't decay, time still moves, but it no longer wears everything down into dust. Death itself is destroyed. The resurrected stand in perfected bodies reunited with their souls. Animals are renewed. The elements are restored to their pristine state. The lie has run its course and exhausted its ability to do anything. Morally, the implications are stark. The universe turns out not to be an endlessly grinding wheel under which everyone is eventually crushed. It's more like a long trial in which every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every act of courage or cowardice gets entered into the record. And then, at the final judgment, the entire system is reordered permanently around that truth. From a world ages perspective, Zoroastrianism is giving us a hybrid model. On one hand, it agrees with the other traditions we've seen that the closing stretch of an age feels like everything is coming apart. Falsehood, injustice, and violence spike. The stories describe it almost like a fever before a breaking point. On the other hand, it insists that this is not just another round in a forever repeating cycle. There is a final age, there is a last battle. After Scarcity, there is no new infiltration of evil, no new Iron Age lurking over the horizon. Time continues, but under a stable, healed order. When you pull back and compare, some parallels and differences stand out. Like the Indian Yugas, the Zoroastrian scheme is morally loaded. It's not just about astronomical cycles or dynastic successions. It's about how close human society is to its ideal of righteousness. Like the Greek ages, it has a sense of decline from an original perfection toward a more corrupt present. Like the Mesoamerican myths, it projects a future moment when the current way the world works will end and a new order begins. But the mechanisms aren't identical. In Mesoamerican stories, a sun can end because gods get annoyed with humans, or because a giant jaguar, wind, fire, or flood sweeps the board. In the Yuga system, moral decline maps onto cosmic time, but the engine that drives the turnover is more metaphysical than narrative. When the Dark Age is done, the wheel resets. In Zoroastrianism, the driver is a sustained, intentional moral conflict. The end isn't a random catastrophe. It's the logical outcome of a long duel between Usher and Druge, wisdom and the hostile spirit, in which human choices have mattered at every stage. It's worth keeping a note of caution in mind here. Zoroastrian scriptures come in layers. The Gathas, the oldest hymns, probably closest to whatever Zarathustra actually taught, are poetic, dense, and less systematized. Later Avestan texts fill in more mythic detail. Then, centuries afterward, Middle Persian commentaries and theological works build elaborate timelines, name specific future saviors, and paint richer pictures of Scarcity. Scholars debate how much of the precise 12,000-year scheme, or the three seosciants or certain end-time scenes go back to early doctrine, and how much crystallized gradually as priests, communities and later empires, especially under the Sasanians, tried to make sense of older material and the political realities they lived through. So when we talk about Zoroastrian world ages, we're looking at a tradition that has evolved and reinterpreted itself over a very long span. The broad arc, a morally structured history, an intensifying struggle, and a final renovation, is fairly consistent. The fine print changes. What matters for our pattern hunt is that here, very clearly, the end of an age is not the extinction of meaning. It's the moment when meaning gets enforced. Everything untrue is exposed. Everything corrupted is burned clean. The world doesn't get switched off, it gets upgraded. And from this Iranian plateau, that way of thinking about history, linear, morally polarized, aimed at a final decisive renovation, will leak out into other traditions. It will seep into Second Temple Judaism, mix with local ideas about ages and kingdoms, and eventually shape some of the most influential apocalyptic expectations on the planet. Which is exactly where we're going next, into the texts and movements that took this template of one last age, one last tribulation, one renewed world, and rewrote it in the language of prophets, messiahs, and a coming kingdom of God. By the time you reach the late books of the Hebrew Bible and the swirl of Second Temple Judaism, you can feel that Iranian way of thinking humming underneath the text. This sense that history isn't just a blur of empires, it's divided into phases, and we're somewhere near the sharp edge of the timeline. In earlier biblical material, time is mostly told through stories: creation, flood, patriarchs, exodus, kings, exile, return. God acts, humans respond. Covenants are made and broken. There are blessings and curses, judgments and restorations. But the horizon is still relatively open-ended. The prophets warn of the day of the Lord, a time when God will intervene, judge injustice, and vindicate the oppressed, but that day can be a near event, like the fall of a local kingdom, as much as a final cosmic showdown. By the Second Temple period, roughly the last few centuries before the Common Era, and the first century or so into it, something shifts. The world these communities are living in is brutal. Foreign empires march through like clockwork. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Seleucids, Romans. The temple is destroyed, rebuilt, defiled, rededicated. Local elites collaborate with overlords. Revolts flare, get crushed. To be a small people with big promises about God's rule in that environment is to live in a constant low-grade existential crisis. Out of that pressure, a clearer two-age scheme crystallizes. New Testament writers will later summarize it in a concise phrase, this age, and the age to come. But the ingredients are already there in late biblical and intertestamental texts. This age is the current order of things, the time when the wicked often prosper, foreign powers dominate, the righteous suffer, and death, disease, and injustice feel like normal weather. It's the age where, as one Dead Sea Scroll puts it, the world lies under the sway of the lot of Belial, the forces of darkness. The age to come is the world put right, God's reign fully manifested, justice enforced, the dead raised, creation healed, and evil decisively constrained or removed. You see hints in Daniel, in Isaiah 24, 27 and 65, 66, in later apocalyptic writings like 1 Enoch and 4 Ezra. Sometimes it's pictured as a transformed earth, sometimes as a new heaven and new earth, but the basic move is the same. History is framed between two poles, the present evil age and a future renewed order, and the bridge between them, tribulation. To get there, the story says, you don't just drift gently into peace and justice. You pass through a final compression of crisis, a time of unmatched distress where the fault lines of this age split open. That's where apocalyptic literature makes its entrance. The word apocalypse just means unveiling, a pulling back of the curtain. But in this world it becomes a specific genre, crisis literature written in symbols, visions and coded imagery, usually attributed to some ancient figure, Enoch, Moses, Ezra, Baruch, but actually addressing the author's present. Think of texts like Daniel 7:12, parts of Zechariah, then later one, Enoch, 2 Baruch, 4 Ezra, the war scroll from Qumran, and, in the Christian stream, the book of Revelation. These writings are not calm theological treatises. They're battle songs recorded in code. Why the code? Because they are, in part, veiled political commentary. When Daniel talks about a series of beasts rising from the sea, each replaced by another, most scholars see a symbolic history of empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the breakup of Alexander's kingdom. When it describes a blasphemous little horn that desecrates the sanctuary, many read it as a thinly disguised portrait of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who outlawed Jewish practices and defiled the temple in the 160s BCE. Writing directly, the current king is an abomination and his days are numbered, under that regime could get you killed. Writing, I saw a horn speaking great things is safer, and crucially more portable. It can be reread and reapplied when the next beast shows up. But apocalyptic literature is not only political satire in costume. It's also pastoral and moral. These texts are written to communities asking, is faithfulness worth it? Has God forgotten us? Are we fools for staying loyal when compromise would make life so much easier? The answer, in apocalyptic mode, is a thunderous no. What you see right now is not the whole story. The cosmic court is in session. The Ancient of Days is already taking his seat. The books are being opened, that's why hope and urgency sit side by side in these writings. On one hand, they insist that the apparent victory of evil is temporary. The kingdoms of this age, however savage, however technologically advanced, are just animals thrashing around under a higher judgment. On the other hand, they ramp up the pressure on their readers. Your choices in this moment matter enormously. Compromising with the beast, worshipping its image, aligning with oppressive power, that's not a minor slip. That is choosing the wrong side at the end of the age. Within this framework, certain end-of-age motifs start recurring with eerie regularity. Lawlessness. The prophets had already decried social injustice, corrupt courts, and predatory elites. Apocalyptic texts take that decay and frame it as a global fever. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, says one early Christian text, summarizing a theme that goes back into Jewish writings. The Torah, God's wise order for life, is despised. Truth falls in the streets. Oaths and covenants mean nothing. The bonds that hold communities together fray. False leaders. Sometimes they're kings, sometimes they're priests, sometimes they're pseudo-prophets or messianic pretenders. In Daniel and its descendants, you get arrogant rulers who exalt themselves as divine, demand worship, and persecute dissent. Later, Jewish and Christian texts talk about deceivers who perform signs, twist scripture, and seduce people into allegiance with the wrong kingdom. The label shifts: little horn, man of lawlessness, Antichrist, but the archetype is the same: charismatic power harnessed to deception at the close of the age. Persecution and testing. The end isn't pictured as a time when the faithful quietly retire to a safe corner, while God does the heavy lifting. It's a time when their loyalty is tested most intensely. Daniel's 3 companions in the furnace, Daniel in the lion's den, these stories function as prototypes. The faithful, under foreign rule, refuse to bow to idolatrous power and face lethal consequences. Later apocalypses extend that pattern to entire communities. Some are killed, some are imprisoned, many are pressured to assimilate. End-time imagery keeps circling back to that crucible. Cosmic signs. The heavens themselves seem to participate in the transition. You get language of the sun darkened, the moon turned to blood, stars falling, the powers of the heavens shaken. In many cases, this is stock imagery for the downfall of kings and kingdoms. Ancient Near Eastern texts regularly describe imperial collapse as stars dimming and skies shaking. But in Apocalyptic, those metaphors stack. Political upheaval, environmental disaster, and literal astronomical events blur into one palette of the world as we know it is coming apart. None of this needs to be read as a neat, one-to-one prediction checklist, a script where you can say, this war, that politician, that earthquake, that's verse 7b. Historically, every attempt to map apocalyptic texts like a weather forecast has ended up looking very dated, very fast. What these narratives are doing at their core is something deeper. They are giving oppressed communities a way to interpret extreme crisis without surrendering their belief that the universe is morally structured. When your city is burning, your leaders are corrupt, and your people are scattered. You can conclude either there is no order, only chaos, or the order is hidden, but it's real, and what looks like chaos is the convulsion before a new equilibrium. Apocalyptic opts firmly for the second. It says the fracture you're living through is not meaningless. It is the exposure of everything that has been wrong with this age. So the stories follow a pattern that should feel familiar by now. Fracture. The existing order loses coherence. Law collapses into violence. Institutions rot. Religious systems are compromised. Ordinary people are caught in the crossfire of imperial games. Ordeal. That breakdown concentrates into a time of intensified suffering and decision. Persecution, deception, and catastrophe compress into what some texts call birth pangs, the pain before something new emerges. The endurance or failure of the faithful under pressure becomes the decisive drama of the age. Renewal. on the far side of that ordeal is not just a reset to the previous status quo. It's a qualitatively different order, the age to come. In Jewish and Christian apocalyptic visions that can look like a resurrected community, a restored Jerusalem, a new heaven and new earth, where God's presence is no longer veiled and death is finally defanged. The beasts are gone. The idols are stripped of power. Tears are wiped away. Spiritually, that story says, history is not an endless treadmill. It's a moral arc that bends through judgment toward restoration. Politically, it says no empire is ultimate, and aligning yourself too deeply with any regime in this age is a dangerous bet. And socially, it reinforces the same world-age template we've been tracing from India to Greece, to Mesoamerica to Iran. As ages run down, pressures build. Systems strain, leaders fail, violence and falsehood spike. Then, in mythic memory and prophetic imagination, comes the plunge through chaos into a reordered world. Whether you read these texts as literal roadmaps of the future, as symbolic commentaries on their own time, or as deep psychological scripts that human societies keep replaying, the structure is the same: fracture, ordeal, renewal. And as we turn next to the Norse sagas and broader Indo-European echoes, that structure will surface again. This time with wolves swallowing the sun, world trees shaking, and a battlefield where even the gods are not spared. If you grew up with Marvel movies, it's easy to hear the word Ragnarok and think, oh yeah, that's the Viking apocalypse. End of the world. Everything explodes. Roll credits. The actual myths are doing something more interesting. In the Norse material, Ragnarok isn't just, and then everything dies. It follows almost exactly the age-ending template we've been tracing: moral decay, broken bonds, catastrophic conflict, and then unmistakably world renewal. The seeds are planted long before the final battle. In the poetic Edda's Völuspá, the seeress describes an earlier golden time when the gods lived in harmony, played in their meadows, forged their treasures, and swore oaths on a sacred ring. There is order, play, beauty, and binding promises. Then there is a turn. The gods commit their own first great wrong when they break an oath and kill the wise figure Gullveig, Heidh, sometimes seen as a seeress or a witch. 3 times they burn her, 3 times she returns. After this comes the first war among the gods, the feud between the Aesir and the Vanir. Right there you already have the basic pattern: a violation of sacred trust, a breakdown of the previous order, and a war that shatters the old harmony. From that fracture, the story says, the world slides toward a final crisis. Fimbulvetr, the great winter, descends. 3 winters with no summer between. Brothers turn on brothers, oaths mean nothing, kinship bonds dissolve. The Völva says, an axe age, a sword age, shields are cloven. A wind age, a wolf age before the world falls. Lawlessness, treachery, and social collapse are the weather of the end. That's our first beat: moral decay and broken bonds. The second is catastrophic conflict on a scale that pulls in everything: gods, giants, monsters, and the natural world itself. The wolves Skull and Hearty swallow the sun and moon. Stars vanish. The great world tree Yggdrasil trembles. Loki breaks free from his bonds. The Midgard serpent Jormungandr rises from the sea, thrashing and spilling poison over land and sky. Naglfar, the ship made from dead men's nails, loosens from its moorings and sails with giants and the dead to the battlefield. Fire giants led by Surtur come from the south, their flames consuming earth and sky. The gods know it's coming. They've always known. Odin has asked the seeress about it. He's sacrificed himself on Yggdrasil to gain wisdom. He's traded an eye for insight at Mimir's well. But foreknowledge doesn't let them avoid the outcome. It only prepares them to meet it. They ride out anyway. Odin faces the great wolf Fenrir and is devoured. Thor fights the Midgard serpent, kills it, takes 9 steps, and falls dead from its poison. Freyr meets Surtur without the sword he once gave away, and dies. Heimdall and Loki kill each other. Tyr and the hound Garma do the same. This is not a surgical judgment on the wicked, while the righteous watch from the sidelines. It's a total system failure in which even the highest powers are pulled under. The gods are not untouchable administrators of the cycle. They are participants in the age's doom. Then comes the third beat, the reset. After all the fire, poison, and flood, the texts do not fade to black. Völuspá continues. The earth rises again from the sea, green. Waterfalls pour. An eagle hunts fish over renewed rivers. Grain grows unsown in the fields. The surviving gods, Balder and Herd returning from the underworld, along with a few who lived through the battle, gather on the plain where Asgard once stood. They find the golden game pieces the gods played with in the early innocent age. They remember. And humans survive too. A man and a woman, Lif and Lifthrasir, have hidden in the wood of Yggdrasil during the crisis. They endure on morning dew. After the fires burn out and the waters recede, they emerge and repopulate the world. Humanity does not end at Ragnarok. It restarts from a tiny remnant. That survival and repopulation motif should sound very familiar by now. It's the same structural move as a single righteous family in a boat riding out a flood in Mesopotamian and biblical stories. It's the Mesoamerican pattern of a few people hidden in a cave, or turned into trees or ants or birds until the 5th sun rises and they can come out. It's the Indian idea that even in the Kali Yuga, a seed of Dharma survives into the next Satya Yuga. An age breaks, a remnant huddles somewhere liminal under a tree, in a boat, inside a mountain, within a cosmic tree, and then walks out into a world rinsed clean. Norse myth just wraps that structure in wolves, ice, and fire. Now, how ancient is this story really? That sounds like a weird question, but it matters. Our main sources for Ragnarok, like most of Norse mythology, were written down in Christian Iceland in the 13th century, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, and scattered references in skaldic poetry and sagas. They are reporting an oral tradition that had been circulating for centuries, maybe longer among Germanic and Scandinavian peoples. But oral tradition is not a static recording, it's a living system. It adapts, recombines, and reinterprets in every generation. When a 13th century Icelander writes, "And then the sun is darkened, stars fall from the sky, the world burns, and a new earth arises," is he transmitting a Bronze Age Indo-European image almost untouched? Is he blending older Germanic material with Christian apocalyptic motifs he's heard in church? Is he doing both at once? Most scholars would say both. There are clear Indo-European echoes here. Comparative mythologists have long noticed that many Indo-European traditions, Norse, Indian, Iranian, some early Greek material, talk about world cycles, great winters or fires, and cosmic battles that reset the order. The idea of an end that is also a new beginning seems to be part of a very old shared repertoire. At the same time, it's hard not to notice how some elements of Ragnarok's last act sound like they've been in conversation with Christian eschatology, a final cosmic battle, the heavens darkened, fire consuming the world, a renewed earth, a kind of post-apocalyptic gathering of the blessed. Even the return of Balder from the underworld can look through a Christian lens like a resurrection motif. So when we call Ragnarok ancient, we're dealing with layers. There may be a deep Indo-European template about a great unbinding at the end of a cycle, when imprisoned monsters break loose, cosmic order trembles, and the world is remade. On top of that, there are Germanic tribal experiences of real social collapse, migrations, winters of famine. Then there are centuries of contact with Christianity, where ideas of final judgment, cosmic fire, and new creation are very much in the air. By the time a medieval scribe pins the story to vellum, those layers are fused. That blending actually sharpens our main theme rather than blurring it. Because across all those influences, the core move stays the same. Apocalypse is not pure finality. It's clearing for rebirth. If you zoom out from the frost giants and the talking eagles, Ragnarok is an answer to a basic existential question. If the world is wrong, how can it be made right? Not just patched, not just slightly improved, but genuinely reset. One intuitive answer is annihilation. Erase everything. Full stop. That's the modern end of the world instinct. Heat death of the universe. Asteroid impact, doomsday device. But myth, over and over, resists absolute nihilism. It almost always smuggles in a seed. Someone hides in a tree. Someone clings to a raft. A few gods survive. A book is rescued. A fire is kept alive in a cave. The next chapter doesn't start from nothing. It starts from a remnant that remembered the previous age and carries both its wounds and its wisdom. Norse myth leans hard into that paradox. Ragnarok is brutal. There is no pretense that good people skate past the consequences. The gods die, heroes die. Humans get caught in the flood and fire. The story doesn't protect its protagonists, and yet it refuses to say, and then nothing. It insists instead, and then this, green earth. Unsown grain. A couple emerging from the world tree. The gods sitting in the grass, turning over their old golden game pieces, remembering what went wrong, maybe wondering how not to repeat it. Ragnarok, then, is not just a Viking death metal fantasy. It's one of the clearest narrative blueprints we have of the reset idea. An age runs down through moral decay and broken relationships. Forces that were chained, wolves, serpents, tricksters, giants, are unleashed. There is a climactic conflict where existing powers exhaust themselves. The world breaks, and out of that break, after a period of terror, something new and simpler and strangely idyllic appears. Which brings us back to the question hanging over this whole episode. Why do cultures keep imagining endings as both destruction and restoration? Why isn't the story just? It all burns and that's it. Why do we keep adding? But a few survive. A new order rises. The game pieces are found again? Is it wishful thinking our refusal to face extinction? Is it historical memory, echoes of real collapses, where some people did survive and rebuild? Is it psychological, a deep sense that breakdown and breakthrough are somehow intertwined? As we move into the next sections and look at the same ending patterns in more modern terms, moral collapse, inequality, system strain, and catastrophic purge, Ragnarok will sit in the background as a kind of mythic template. A story that dares to say, yes, the structures you trust can and do fail spectacularly. Yes, even the highest powers you appeal to can be caught in that failure. But no, that isn't the end of the story. It's the hinge between ages. If you line up all these world-age stories from different cultures, the first act of the ending almost never starts with comets or earthquakes. It starts with people not keeping their word. Before the floods rise, before the sun goes dark, before the gods ride out to their last battle, you get a slow, sour drift in how humans, or gods, or both, treat each other. That's the same ending pattern number one. A story of moral decline that's really a story about the collapse of trust. In the Indian Yuga system, this shows up as the shrinking of Dharma, the cosmic order, from 4 legs to 3 to 2 to 1. But how do the texts actually describe that? They don't say, gravity weakens or atoms get weird. They say, rulers become unjust, children disobey parents, friends betray friends, merchants cheat, teachers sell knowledge instead of transmitting it as a duty. The Bhagavata Purana says that in the Kali Yuga, wealth alone will be considered the sign of a man's good birth. proper behaviour and fine qualities. Titles and status detach from virtue and reattach to money and power. In Hesiod's 5 Ages, the same move plays out with Greek flavour. The Golden Age humans lived like gods, free from toil and grief. The Silver Age is already worse. People are immature, violent, and would not worship the immortals. But it's the Bronze and Iron Ages where trust really fractures. Hesiod says bluntly of his own Iron Age that there will be no help against evil, that brother will not be friend to brother, that guest will be unkind to host, companion to companion, and that oaths and justice will be twisted by brute force. Again, the focus isn't on weather patterns, it's on social promises that no longer hold. Second Temple Jewish and early Christian texts do something similar. When they talk about this age versus the age to come, the signs of the end aren't mostly about physics. They're about betrayal, false prophets, rulers abusing power, religious leaders becoming hypocrites, families divided. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, seeing itself as living at the end of an age, described the surrounding society as one where truth stumbles and the wicked twist justice. The Book of Revelation critiques economic exploitation and corrupt imperial power in the image of Babylon, a dazzling city built on deceit and violence. Even the more cosmic-sounding systems keep coming back to this same first beat. In Zoroastrian thought, as the long world cycle moves toward its final renovation, the lie druge spreads and infiltrates institutions. In some Mesoamerican material, the sun ends not just because the gods decide to swap it out, but because people no longer perform their ritual duties. The reciprocity between humans and gods has broken down. Why this obsession with oaths, kinship, and legitimacy? Because in small-scale societies and ancient states alike, those were your operating systems. A written contract could help, a law code could help, but the real glue was, I believe you will do what you say, because you have a name, a lineage, a god, and a community to answer to. If that belief collapses, you don't just get a few more liars. You get a world where planning becomes impossible. That's why these myths linger on broken promises and corrupted authority. Oaths are how you bind the future. Family ties are your basic safety net. Legitimacy of kings, priests, judges is how you accept decisions you don't personally control. So when a culture wants to dramatize an age going bad, it attacks those points first. Look back at Ragnarok with that lens. The turning point was a broken oath and an unjust killing. After that you get brother against brother, and an age where oaths are broken, bonds are severed. The cosmic wolves don't eat the sun until the social wolves have already eaten trust. The same structure shows up in softer forms elsewhere. In late Vedic and early classical Indian texts, kings at the end of an age are described as greedy, addicted to pleasure, neglectful of ritual duties. Householders ignore obligations to ancestors. Teachers hoard knowledge. The whole social ecology of obligation is fraying. You could call that moral decline, and the texts do, but what they're really tracking is the failure of people to reliably play their roles. Now, whose fault is this supposed to be? Here it gets interesting, because different traditions point fingers in different directions, and that contrast tells us something. In some versions of the Yuga story, elites are the main villains. Kings are unjust, priests are corrupt, judges take bribes. When the top is rotten, the argument goes, the rest of society follows. Think about the biblical prophets railing not primarily at random sinners, but at rulers who grind the faces of the poor, at priests who teach for a price, at merchants who rig the scales. The end of an age, in that view, starts with institutional betrayal. In other traditions, especially some Greek and Roman writers looking back with nostalgia, commoners take the blame. They complain that people in general have become lazy, dishonest, and soft. Satirists from Juvenal to later moralists describe crowds clamouring only for bread and circuses, uninterested in civic virtue or the old ways. Here the anxiety is that the masses no longer live up to some imagined earlier toughness and restraint. Then you have texts like Hesiod's Iron Age complaint, or some apocalyptic Jewish writings where the blame spreads everywhere. Parents, children, rulers, traders, neighbours, foreigners, every category gets a line in the indictment. Trust isn't just broken vertically between rulers and ruled, it's breaking horizontally between peers. That shared blame pattern matters because it suggests that ancient people weren't just scapegoating one group. They were groping toward an intuition that when trust wobbles in one area, it tends to propagate. If you can't trust your king to be fair, maybe you're a little more willing to cheat your neighbour. If everyone is cheating a little, maybe the king feels justified skimming more. It's a feedback loop. What do we do with all this from a modern sociological angle without just saying, they were right and we are obviously in the Kali Yuga now? One cautious way to read these moral decline narratives is as early theories of social instability. People were noticing that when mutual expectations break down, everything feels more precarious, and they encoded that feeling as the first symptom of an age's end. Sociologists today talk about social capital, the networks, norms and trust that enable people to cooperate. Economists measure generalized trust, how much you think most people can be trusted versus you can't be too careful. Political scientists study legitimacy, the belief that institutions have the right to rule. When those numbers slide in modern surveys, you don't immediately get a flood or a God war. But you do see more polarization, more conspiracy narratives, more zero-sum thinking, more appetite for strongmen or for burning it all down. Ancient mythmakers didn't have those terms. What they had were stories in which truth itself weakens as an age decays. The Yuga image of Dharma standing on one leg in Kali, the Zoroastrian motif of the lie spreading through the world, the biblical picture of truth fallen in the street. These are poetic ways of saying, trust, both in each other and in the larger order, is failing. At the same time, we need to be careful with the word decline. Every generation tends to think the kids are worse, the music is louder, the manners are gone. Roman elites complained about declining virtue centuries before the Western Empire collapsed, and yet the empire lumbered on. Medieval preachers declared their own time the worst in history, while sitting between plagues and wars that we now separate into distinct eras. A moral panic is not the same thing as an actual systemic breakdown. That's where the metaphor versus forecast distinction comes in. These world-age stories are not weather reports. They're not saying, on Thursday, when the percentage of broken oaths passes 37%, expect scattered apocalypses. They are models for meaning, not fixed scripts. They take real experiences, corruption, betrayal, institutional failure, and plug them into a narrative frame where decline is step one in a three-act drama: decay, crisis, renewal. So when a text says, "In the last age children will rebel against their parents," that tells you what that culture was anxious about, not that there is a cosmic scoreboard of teenage sassiness ticking toward doomsday. When a myth says, "Oaths will be forgotten, rulers will be unjust, and then the world will burn," that's not a guarantee that every trust crisis ends in literal fire. It's a way of insisting that when the fabric of trust rips far enough, something big has to give. Read this way, pattern number one, the moral decline and collapse of trust, is less a prophecy and more a diagnostic. A warning that if promises, roles and legitimacy corrode deeply enough, the system that depends on them becomes fragile. And that's the bridge to the next pattern. Because in these stories, the erosion of trust doesn't just make everyone sad and cynical and then fade out. It sets the stage for material and structural strain. When you can't coordinate well, when you don't believe in the fairness of the game, managing resources, inequality, and crisis gets much harder. The myths say it in their own way. After the age of broken oaths comes the age of famine, injustice, and crushing burdens. After trust collapses, the economy of the age starts to buckle. Once trust is wounded, the next act in these stories almost always looks the same. Things get tight, not immediately, not everywhere at once, but slowly, as if the world itself is being squeezed. Food runs short, taxes go up, work gets harder, a few people seem to glide above the pain, and everyone else feels like they're walking uphill with stones in their pockets. That's same ending pattern number 2. Inequality, scarcity, and systems pushed past what they can really handle. You can see it clearly in the late Yuga material. In some Purana texts, the Kali Yuga isn't just about people being meaner. It's about landlords and kings extracting more than the land can bear, about harvests failing, about common people being harried by drought, famine, and heavy taxation. The Bhagavata Purana says that in the last phase, the people will be harassed by drought and excessive taxes, and that rulers will plunder the people's wealth under the pretense of taxation. Scarcity and predation get braided together. That pairing shows up again and again. Environmental strain plus human opportunism. In Hesiod's Iron Age, the world isn't simply morally worse, it's materially harsher. The Golden Age had grain that grew by itself and a life without toil. By the time we reach iron, the earth gives up her produce only, with grievous toil, and even that limited bounty is unequally secured. The strong seize more, the weak are left to struggle. Later Greek writers fold that memory into a broader narrative. Over time, the land is exhausted, luxury corrupts the rich, and the poor become more desperate. Biblical and Second Temple texts put this dynamic front and center. When prophets describe the day of the Lord or the shaking of this age, they don't only talk about idols and blasphemy. They talk about withheld wages, land monopolies, rigged markets, food shortages. The Book of Amos pictures the elites lying on beds of ivory, while the poor are sold for a pair of sandals. Isaiah rails against those who join house to house and add field to field until there is no land left for others. That pattern, property concentration, debt, peonage, shrinking margins for everyone else, shows up as a symptom that the system is out of balance and headed for a reckoning. Revelation pushes that critique into apocalyptic imagery. The horseman of famine rides out holding scales. A voice announces that a day's wage will barely buy enough grain to live on. That's not a random horror, it's a wage-price ratio. It's a picture of an economy in which the basics of life have slipped out of reach for the average worker, while the merchants of the earth grow fat on luxury goods. The collapse that follows isn't just cosmic, it's the implosion of an overstretched unfair order. Zoroastrian tradition does something similar with different symbols. As the long age darkens, misrule and greed spread, and the earth itself suffers. Some late texts describe livestock failing, crops withering, winters growing harsher. Human injustice is mirrored by ecological disruption. The final renovation, the Frasca Coretti, is framed not only as moral purification, but as the healing of a world that has been exhaustively exploited. Why do these stories keep linking moral rot to droughts and famines? One reason might be simple observation. In agrarian societies, bad years come. Climate swings, volcanic eruptions, regional droughts, modern paleoclimate data suggests these were recurring features, not rare anomalies. When the rains fail or the river floods at the wrong time, it's not an inconvenience. It's existential. But a bad harvest by itself doesn't automatically create myth. What people notice and remember are the patterns of who suffers and who doesn't, and how the institutions respond. Think about how complex societies are built. They run on specialization. Most people are not growing their own food anymore. They're weaving cloth, making tools, building walls, serving in the military, performing rituals, writing accounts. That's incredibly powerful. Specialization lets you build cities, armies, irrigation systems, temples, ships. It also creates long dependency chains. If you're a scribe in a Bronze Age palace, your ability to eat depends on a farmer you'll never meet, on weather you can't control, on storage systems you don't manage, on overseers you might not trust, on a ration distribution office that can miscount or play favorites. In a good year, the system feels abundant and impressive. In a bad year, every link becomes a potential failure point. Add hierarchy to that web, and the stakes go up. The king and the temple and the noble households are at the top of the distribution network. Their claims are fixed. The gods must receive their offerings, the palace must feed its retainers, the garrison must be maintained. When scarcity hits, ancient states almost never start cutting from the very top. They squeeze lower down, raising taxes, demanding corvée labour, seizing stores, enforcing debts more harshly. From the bottom, that can feel like theft dressed up as duty. From the top, it can feel like necessity. If we don't secure these granaries and keep the troops paid, the whole thing collapses. That's governance overload, a state structure trying to solve real problems with limited information, rigid tools, and a shrinking margin of error. Officials impose new rules to stabilize the system. Those rules create new resentments and black markets. The center dispatches inspectors, local elites learn to game or resist them. The bureaucracy grows, but trust in it shrinks. Complexity rises and resilience falls. Historians like Joseph Tainter have argued that many ancient collapses follow this arc. As societies solve problems by layering on complexity, new offices, new infrastructures, new obligations, they reap benefits for a while. Eventually, the returns on added complexity diminish, and the cost of maintaining the structure becomes more than the society can or will pay, especially when shocks, climate, invasion, epidemics hit. Ancient people didn't write that out in systems diagrams. They told stories in which the gods grow angry, the land grows stingy, and kings exploit their subjects. But the bones of the dynamic are there. Specialization, dependency, unequal burden, brittle institutions. Take the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. The archaeological and textual record suggests a cluster of stresses: droughts, or at least years of poor harvests, increased warfare and migration, supply chains for tin and other key materials breaking down, palace economies that had been finely tuned to funnel resources through central warehouses and redistribute them to specialists, suddenly faced shortages and disruption. Linear B tablets from Mycenaean sites show last-minute reallocations of grain and weapons. Within a few decades, many of those palaces burned or were abandoned. Later Greek memory turned that into the fall of heroic kingdoms, the end of an age of heroes, the onset of a harsher Iron Age. The myths don't explain the collapse in a modern causal sense, but they encode a sense that something overstressed and unfair gave way. Or look at late classic Maya polities. There's evidence of prolonged droughts in some regions, increased warfare, overstratified cities where monumental building and elite competition intensified even as commoner nutrition declined. The long count calendar doesn't say drought plus inequality equals collapse, but some inscriptions get thinner, more obsessed with royal self-promotion as the ecological and social base cracks underneath. In all these cases, myth and memory tend to interpret material crises as cosmic imbalance or divine displeasure. Drought becomes a sign that the king has failed in his ritual duties. Famine becomes proof that people have abandoned traditional norms. Class exploitation becomes a reason for a god to hear the cry of the oppressed and overturn the order. That doesn't mean the ancients were confusing weather with morality in a childish way. It means they lived in systems where legitimacy and provisioning were tightly fused. The ruler's right to rule wasn't a legal abstraction. It was demonstrated in part by rain and grain. If those faltered, you had a legitimacy crisis baked into your food crisis. Inequality intensifies that perception. When everyone is hungry, you can still imagine we're all in this together. When granaries are full behind walls and people outside the walls starve, the story shifts. In some Mesopotamian laments, the gods are described as having abandoned the city, but human injustice is implicated too. Judges taking bribes, the poor being dispossessed. The cosmic withdrawal mirrors a social one, the powerful withdrawing solidarity from the vulnerable. Myths turn that into narrative shorthand. The world is out of joint. The scales are unbalanced. The pillars of the earth tremble. Underneath those images you can often glimpse drought graphs, tax records and ration lists, though we only have those for a small fraction of past societies. It's important to keep a sense of proportion here. Not every drought ushered in an age's end. Many complex societies endured multiple resource shocks and bounced back, or transformed without total collapse. In some cases, elites managed genuine reforms, debt cancellations, land redistribution, grain doles, that shored up legitimacy and spread the pain more widely. What the recurring age-ending stories seem to notice, though, is a particular configuration. When scarcity bites, when inequality is stark, and when trust in the fairness and competence of institutions is already eroded from pattern number one. That's when systems feel fragile in a qualitatively different way. You get what modern analysts might call polycrisis, multiple stresses feeding each other. Food shortages feed political unrest. Political unrest leads rulers to crack down, which disrupts trade. Disrupted trade worsens shortages. Conspiracy theories spread. Some groups hoard, others revolt. The story space becomes crowded with rumours that the gods are angry, that prophecies are being fulfilled, that an age is closing. From a modern angle, we can read these myths as rough models of systemic strain under inequality and scarcity. They are not proofs of a rigid historical law that every civilization must pass through 4 ages and die in famine and revolt. But they are surprisingly consistent reminders that once trust is low, you can't easily manage shared scarcity. And once you can't manage scarcity fairly, people start imagining, and sometimes enacting resets, which is exactly where the third pattern comes in. Because in these stories, inequality and system strain are not the final scene. They are the loaded spring. The pressure builds, unjust rulers, starving peasants, empty temples, angry gods, omens in the sky. And then something snaps. Flood, fire, invasion, revolution, judgment day. The myths give that snap 1,000 faces. Underneath, they're all wrestling with the same question. What happens when a stressed, unequal, low-trust system finally hits a shock it can't absorb? That snap moment almost never looks like a careful committee meeting. It looks like the sky breaking, across cultures. Once the pressure has built, the end of an age arrives wrapped in catastrophe. Not just any misfortune, but something totalizing. Something that feels like it sweeps the board. Sometimes it's water. A flood that drowns whole landscapes, washes away cities, resets the count back to 0. Sometimes it's fire. A world burned, a rain of sparks from the sky, a final summer that never ends, or a final winter that never thaws. Sometimes it's war, not just another battle, but a war that feels final. The last conflict. The one after which there's nothing left to fight over. Sometimes it's plague, a sickness that cuts through every class and every defence, killing soldiers and kings and beggars alike. Sometimes it's darkness, suns blotted out, stars falling, a long night that interrupts time itself. And sometimes it's framed as a cosmic battle. Gods versus demons, light versus darkness, order versus chaos, acting out in myth what people are experiencing in their streets and fields. If you map all these myths side by side, you start to notice that they aren't random. They're doing the same narrative job. They are clearing events. A flood doesn't just kill people. It wipes the slate. It tears up boundary markers, washes away old houses, erases records. In story logic that matters, if you want to imagine a radically different world on the other side, it helps if the previous one has been physically removed. Fire does something similar with different symbolism. It doesn't merely destroy, it purifies. It burns off the old growth to make room for new. Zoroastrian imagery runs on this. At the end of the age there is a river of molten metal that burns away falsehood and leaves only what is true. That's terrifying if you're on the wrong side of it, but narratively it's very efficient. All the ambiguity, all the messy compromises of lived history are reduced to one searing test. War plays that role too. The wars that end ages are not small border conflicts. They're framed as total. The Trojan War, the Mahabharata's Kurukshetra War, the battles of Gog and Magog in Jewish and Christian apocalyptic imagination. They pit entire ways of life against each other, and then, crucially, they end with one side decisively gone. That's a clearing function. Once Troy has fallen, once the Kauravas are dead, once the forces of Gog are annihilated, the story has removed a whole political configuration from the board. Plague and famine function in a slightly different but related way. They don't erase the built environment the way fire and flood do, but they hollow out the population. In the Bible, when the angel of death passes through Egypt, the firstborn die, and in one night a power structure is fatally weakened. In medieval and early modern Christian imagination, the Black Death is remembered not just as a horror, but as a turning point that broke feudal structures and reshaped economies. In story form, disease becomes the invisible scythe that mows down the mighty along with the weak, making room for a different arrangement. Darkness and cosmic signs, eclipses, stars falling, skies rolled up like scrolls are the most explicitly symbolic. They say, the order you trusted is not permanent. Even the heavens can be shut off. In some Second Temple Jewish texts, the darkening of the sun or the falling of stars are not just special effects. They're the fabric of the old age tearing so that a new one can be stitched in. From a storytelling point of view, Catastrophe is incredibly useful. First, it compresses change. Real historical transformations are usually slow, uneven, and confusing. Institutions decay, new movements rise, economies shift. Lots of people live and die in the middle of it, thinking they're in continuity, even as big things change around them. Myths don't like that kind of blur. They prefer sharp thresholds. Before and after, Golden Age, Iron Age, Old Covenant, New Covenant, previous sun, next sun. A single enormous event, a flood, a war, a cosmic fire, lets you take a drawn-out process and squeeze it into one memorable scene. It becomes the hinge on which the story turns. Everything that came before can be treated as one era. Everything after is another. The messiness in between gets symbolically folded into the catastrophe. Second, catastrophe justifies a new order. If the old regime was merely bad, or the old customs were merely unfair, you still have to answer awkward questions. Why these new laws and not others? Why this prophet, this king, this priesthood, this constitution? If the old world was literally destroyed, if the gods drowned it, or fire consumed it, or demons overran it and had to be slain, then the need for something entirely new becomes self-evident. You're not tweaking rules anymore, you're rebuilding from foundations. The catastrophe becomes a moral argument. The reason the flood came, the story says, was that people were violent and corrupt, or the reason the gods sent fire was that humans stopped honouring them. The deeper claim is, The old order deserved to fall. That legitimizes whoever claims to embody the lessons of the fall. Which brings us into the purge motif. In most of these myths, the world isn't just destroyed, it's cleansed. The catastrophe is not purely random. It's targeted in a moral sense at the wicked. In the story, it's never that everyone is swept away indiscriminately. There is always a distinction, the scoffers versus the faithful, the unjust rulers versus the righteous remnant, the demons and their allies versus the champions of order. The Mesopotamian flood stories don't just give us a boat builder. They give us a man favoured for his piety or special relationship to a god. The biblical flood has Noah, blameless in his generation. The Mahabharata's war is framed as a terrible, tragic, but ultimately necessary purge of accumulated adharma, wrongdoing, that even the gods cannot tolerate anymore. Ragnarok in Norse myth wipes out gods and giants alike, but the ones who return or arise afterward are associated with a fresh, purified world. This purge can function as an ethical warning. The implicit message is, do not let your society reach this point. Do not accumulate injustice. Do not allow exploitation, impiety, or arrogance to stack up to heaven, or the cleansing wave will come. Apocalyptic prophets often lean heavily on this. Repent, or judgment is coming. Turn back to the law, or the day of the Lord will burn like an oven. It's an attempt to scare people straight, to use the imagined purge as a deterrent. But there's a darker side. Once you have a story structure in which the end of the age arrives by removing the corrupt and wicked, it is very tempting for real human groups to start pointing at their enemies and saying, that's who the wicked are. That's who must be purged for the world to be made right. You can see this in some strands of later apocalyptic and millenarian movements. Political opponents, religious minorities, social outsiders are cast as the embodiment of the age's corruption. Violence against them gets framed not as aggression, but as participation in the coming cleansing. We are helping history along. We are assisting God or destiny in removing the rot. That's where the purge motif, which begins as moral warning, becomes political danger. It gives people a script in which extreme actions feel justified, even holy, because they're imagined as part of a cosmic reset. Beside destruction and cleansing sits the other half of the pattern, rebirth. The reset myth is never just about ending. It's about beginning again. In flood stories there is almost always a boat, a mountain, a seed. Utnapishtim's ark, Noah's ark, Manu's boat in some Indian traditions. The details change, but the structure is the same. A small protected capsule of life rides out the chaos, comes to rest, and repopulates the earth. Those survivors are often depicted as seed people. Their names sometimes literally carry that meaning. They carry the DNA, but also the cultural and legal memory of the previous world. After the waters recede, they receive new instructions. Be fruitful and multiply, re-establish sacrifice, rebuild the temple. The new age is born from a remnant that remembers. Even when the story doesn't use a literal boat, you get a remnant motif. Israel preserved through exile. The righteous who survive the birth pangs of the Messiah in some Jewish apocalyptic texts. The small group who endures the tribulation in Christian Revelation and enters the new heaven and new earth. The men and women in Norse myth who hide in the wood Yggdrasil and emerge after Ragnarok to see a renewed green world. Sometimes the remnant is not people but law. In Zoroastrian thought, the Frashokereti doesn't give us a brand new set of rules. It restores Usha, the right order that was always meant to be. In some Hindu traditions, after the chaos of Kali Yuga, Vishnu incarnates as Kalki to re-establish Dharma. The pattern is the law was always there. The age fell away from it. The catastrophe clears away the accumulated violation. The law is seen again as if new. This is the reset part of the reset myth. The end isn't pure nihilism. It's renovation. An old house gutted by fire and then rebuilt on the same footprint, with some of the same stones, but a different arrangement of rooms. All of this raises a crucial question. How literally should we take these catastrophes? There's no simple answer, because we're dealing with a blend of memory, metaphor, and meaning. On one hand, the Earth's history is full of real disasters. Massive floods from glacial meltwater surges, tsunamis from undersea earthquakes, regional droughts that lasted decades, volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and chilled summers, plagues that killed a third or more of a population, wars that left cities abandoned for centuries. It would be strange if none of that found its way into mythic memory. It seems very likely that some age-ending stories preserve echoes of actual events, telescoped together, magnified and moralized. On the other hand, catastrophe is also a powerful metaphor for transformation. You don't need an actual global flood to feel like your world has ended. The fall of a dynasty, the collapse of an empire, the destruction of a temple, the forced exile of a community, these can feel like total endings from the inside. It makes sense that people would reach for flood and fire and cosmic darkness to express the psychological and social reality of such shifts. So when traditions talk about the end of the age coming with war or darkness or a dissolving of the heavens, they may be layering several things at once, memories of real shocks. Interpretations of long structural changes compressed into a single narrative moment, and deep symbolic language about what it's like when the old patterns no longer work and something fundamentally different has to take their place. The reset myth, then, is not just about doomsday. It's about how humans make sense of turning points. Who deserves to survive, what should be preserved, what must be discarded, and how far the slate must be wiped clean before we can imagine starting over. And when you recognize that, you're in a better position to ask the last unnerving question this calendar of world ages keeps pushing at us. If so many traditions in so many places ended their ages the same way, moral fracture, inequality and strain, followed by some kind of clearing shock, does that mean history is literally repeating itself? Or just that we keep telling the same kind of story whenever we're afraid that it might? Maybe history really is running in circles. Or maybe our brains are. When you line up the Yuga cycle, the Five Suns, Hesiod's metals, Zoroastrian world ages, biblical present evil age, and age to come, Ragnarok, all of it, you can absolutely imagine some cosmic metronome ticking away behind the scenes. But there's another possibility that's at least as interesting, and probably easier to test. Different societies, facing different material problems, keep reinventing the same kind of story because those problems push human minds down the same grooves. In biology, this is called convergent evolution. Put eyes on a squid and eyes on a human. They didn't inherit them from the same recent ancestor, but light is such a basic challenge that evolution keeps stumbling towards similar solutions. Wings show up in insects, birds, bats, different lineages, same physics. Myths do something similar. If you live in a complex society long enough, some pressures are almost guaranteed to show up. Elites separating from commoners, rulers losing legitimacy, public trust eroding, institutions hardening, resources feeling tighter, external shocks arriving at inconvenient times. People start to feel like the old ways aren't working but can't agree on what should replace them. Those are cross-cultural problems. It would be surprising if they didn't generate cross-cultural story shapes. So instead of assuming that an Indian sage and a Maya priest were both reading the same secret cosmic calendar, we can ask a more down-to-earth question. What do these end-of-the-age stories actually do for the people telling them? At a cognitive level, humans are pattern-hunting animals. We notice repetition. We're very good at it. Seasons, day and night, birth and death, rise and fall. The natural world hands us cycles constantly. The agricultural year alone gives you growth, ripening, harvest, barrenness, and then, if you're lucky, growth again. It's not a big leap from there to thinking that history, too, must move in circles. Golden youth, strong maturity, decadent old age, collapse. Righteous beginnings, corrupt middle, cleansing judgment, renewed righteousness. Linear time is actually the weird one. It takes a lot of abstraction to say, no, this is all one straight line from creation to final end, never to be repeated. Most of our psychological experience runs on loops. Then there's how we process misfortune. When things go wrong on a big scale, empires wobbling, temples falling, plagues moving through cities, we almost never shrug and say, random fluctuation in a complex adaptive system. We moralize it. We look for who sinned, who failed, what law was broken, what duty was neglected. We must have done something to deserve this, or at least someone did. The Yuga cycle bakes that in. Each age decays because Dharma is losing its legs. Hesiod's ages slide because humans become less just, less pious. Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts see warfare and famine as birth pangs of judgment. Norse myth wraps the final battle in themes of oath-breaking and betrayal. Collapse becomes not just a structural breakdown, but a verdict. And because we're not satisfied with verdicts that only punch down, we tell the story in a way that also offers a way up. The redemption arc. If you're going to say our age is corrupt and doomed, you almost always add, but there will be a new age, and here's who gets to inherit it. The righteous remnant. The faithful, those who keep the law, follow the true doctrine, support the right king, stay loyal to the right God. From a narrative standpoint, that's essential. If the world just ends, that's not a story. It's a full stop. Stories want continuity. They want survivors, or at least meaning projected beyond the ruin. So cognitively we notice cycles, map moral judgment onto downturns, and then search for a remnant or saviour figure who carries us through into a better configuration. You repeat that basic pattern a few thousand times across a few thousand years, and you don't just get myths, you get story engines, reusable structures that can be filled in with whatever local names, gods, dynasties and disasters you have on hand. And once you have those engines, they become politically useful. If you're a ruler trying to hold on to power in a time of obvious strain, end of the age language lets you frame yourself as the necessary captain in a storm. Yes, things are bad. Yes, the age is dark. That's exactly why you need continuity. That's why revolt would be disastrous. In some late Roman and Byzantine texts, emperors are depicted as catacomb, the restrainer holding back the final chaos. In some Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms, kingship is linked to the maintenance of dharma or the turning of the wheel of law. The hint is, if this throne falls, Kali Yuga deepens, the wheel stops, the age collapses fully. The threatened order says, "We are the last dam before the flood." On the other side, rebels and reformers grab the same motif and flip it. They point to injustice, decadence, oppression, sacrilege, and say, these are the signs that the age is already ending. The rulers are not holding back chaos. They are its embodiment. Overthrowing them isn't simple rebellion. It's cooperation with the inevitable turning of the world. Millenarian movements do this over and over. Peasant revolts in late medieval Europe cast themselves as heralds of the last days. Certain revolutionary sects in Second Temple Judaism saw Rome not just as an empire, but as the beast of the end times. Later, some modern political ideologies quietly borrow New Age language while stripping out the explicit gods. In each case, the end of the age narrative is a tool. It legitimizes change either by sacralizing stability, only we can delay the end, or by sacralizing rupture, only by burning this down can we reach the new world. So where do we get the uncanny overlaps between distant traditions? Yugas, suns, metals, thousand-year kingdoms, some of it is probably diffusion. Ideas travel with traders, soldiers, captives, missionaries. The ancient Near East was a mixing bowl, so was the Hellenistic world. So were the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade network. Iran touches India. India touches Southeast Asia. Greek and Jewish ideas meet in Alexandria. Later, Islamic scholars translate and circulate Greek, Persian, and Indian cosmologies together. When you see very specific shared motifs in connected regions, like a sequence of metallic ages, or a world destroyed by both fire and flood, it's reasonable to suspect borrowing, blending, or at least mutual influence. But diffusion alone doesn't explain the whole map. The Maya weren't getting their long count off Zoroastrian priests. Norse poets weren't reading the Mahabharata, yet their endings rhyme. That's where independent invention comes back in. Any large-scale society wrestling with famine, class conflict, war and leadership crises is living through what feels like a late age. Human nervous systems respond to that with anxiety, anger, nostalgia and yearning. Our story-making apparatus then takes those emotions and organizes them into a narrative that feels right. Decline explains why things hurt. Catastrophe explains why change could actually happen. Rebirth explains why it's worth suffering through. You don't need a trade route for that pattern. You just need brains wired like ours, living together under tension. The most grounded way to read these ancient world age calendars might be something like this. They're not primarily spreadsheets of cosmic dates. They're diagnostic charts. Each tradition took the disorders of its time, corruption, cruelty, loss of meaning, widening gaps between rich and poor, fear of invasion, ecological strain, and wrote them into a cycle. When you see this combination of symptoms, the story says, you're in the late phase. Don't be fooled by surface stability. The world you know is structurally unsustainable. The prescriptions differ. Some call for repentance and stricter law. Some envision a king or messiah. Some fantasize about obliteration and total restart. Some, like parts of the Maya system, are more about marking the turn than moralizing it. But under all the variations, the cycles are ways of thinking about stress, not clocks that force it, which means they don't have to be either literally true or completely false. They can be read as inherited mental tools, pattern templates for noticing when our arrangements are fraying, for asking who benefits from the current order, who's paying the cost, and how much strain a system can take before something snaps. If you look at them that way, the question stops being, did the ancients secretly know the exact year our world will end? And becomes, what were they actually noticing about their own societies when they said, we are living at the end of an age? And how much of that sounds uncomfortably familiar now? So where does that leave us? We've just spent an entire video wandering through other people's calendars. Golden Ages and Iron Ages, First Suns and Fifth Suns, Thousand-Year Kingdoms, Aeons, Yugas, cycles of creation and destruction stacked like gears inside a cosmic clock. Zoomed out, the pattern is almost boring in its consistency. You start in some kind of harmony, cosmos ordered, gods in their right places, kings legit, people mostly behaving, the land more or less generous. Over time, things slip. Not instantly, gradually, standards loosen. Rulers get comfortable. Elites stop feeling bound by the same rules as everybody else. Law becomes harder to enforce on the powerful and easier to weaponize against the weak. Trust drains from institutions, then from neighbors, then from families. Strain builds up in the system, inequality, resource pressure, outside threats, inside rot. Then, somewhere, a shock hits. War, famine, plague, invasion, ecological crash, internal revolution, or some combination. The old arrangement can't absorb it. It breaks. But the story doesn't stop at the break. Almost no one's myths end with, and then everything was just bad forever. They roll the tape one step further, through the fire, through the flood, through the judgment, to a reset. A new age, sometimes purer, sometimes just different, sometimes a return to a lost ideal, sometimes a step toward a final consummation. Decline, crisis, renewal. That's the basic arc we've seen, dressed up in different costumes across India, Greece, Rome, Mesoamerica, the Levant, Iran, Scandinavia, and beyond. So what do we do with that? There are two easy extremes, and both are probably mistakes. One is to take the cycles as literal prophecy. Pick your favourite system, line up the dates, plug in some numerology, and convince yourself we have exactly 12 years and 3 months until the sky cracks and the last avatar, Messiah or Beast, appears on cue. The other extreme is to shrug and say, just stories. People were superstitious. None of this means anything. Both of those positions dodge the actual difficulty, which is that humans are capable of seeing real patterns, and also of making patterns up, and most of our big narratives are some mix of both. Some of what we've talked about in this episode is anchored in historical processes we can study. Empires straining under their own weight, ecological limits, climate swings, pandemics, financial collapses, waves of reform and revolution. Some of it is theological, specific claims about gods, angels, avatars, saviours, demons, moral laws written into the fabric of reality. Some of it is symbolic, psychological, dreams of justice projected onto the future, fears about decay turned into monsters and battles, our need for meaning and closure, sculpting raw events into a satisfying arc. And it is very hard, from our limited point of view inside one time and place, to draw a clean line between those layers. When Hesiod says we live in an iron age full of toil and injustice, he's describing actual social tensions in archaic Greece, but he's also working with mythic metals and a cosmology you and I don't share. When a Maya scribe records the end of a Bacton and links it with upheaval and renewal, they're tracking astronomical cycles, political changes, and a sacred story about how time itself works. When Jewish and Christian texts talk about this age and the age to come, they're wrestling with Roman occupation, internal religious conflict, economic pain, and also with deep convictions about God's character and promise. We can pick out pieces that map onto history. We can see mechanisms, how inequality feeds instability, how ecological damage feeds crisis, how breakdown opens room for new structures. But we should be wary of claiming too much. No ancient tradition came with a peer-reviewed diagram of exactly how many years each age lasts, verified across cultures, testable and repeatable in a lab. The dates don't line up neatly, the details clash. The timescales vary wildly, so epistemic humility, intellectual modesty is warranted. Instead of asking, which cycle is the one true cosmic calendar, we might get more traction from questions like, what were people trying to explain with these cycles? What were they trying to warn against? What were they trying to hope for? And then, which parts of that feel structurally similar to what we're living through now? Because whether or not you think we're in Kali Yuga, the last days, late capitalism, the sunset of modernity, or just Tuesday, you are living in some kind of age. Personally, socially, maybe civilizationally. On a personal level, end of an age moments are actually pretty common. You quit the job you thought you'd have forever, a relationship ends. A parent dies. You move across the world. A belief system that used to anchor you stops making sense. The world you knew doesn't work the way it used to. The institutions or identities that held you together feel brittle or hostile. Old habits stop producing the same results. Most people, standing in that kind of rubble, instinctively reach for the same pattern we've been looking at. Things were better. Then they decayed. Then something snapped. Now I'm in the wreckage. Does anything come after this? That's decline. crisis renewal on the scale of one life, reading the big myths as mirrors, instead of as exact blueprints, offers a different way of holding those experiences. It lets you say, yes, endings are real, systems do decay, trust collapses, things you love can fail or fall apart, and also endings are rarely the end. They are transitions, violent or gentle, into a different configuration. Sometimes worse, sometimes better, usually mixed, but not nothing. On the social scale, something similar is going on. You don't need to believe in a mathematically fixed Yuga calendar to notice that we're living through overlapping stresses, rapid technological change that's outpacing our institutions, economic inequality that leaves huge numbers of people feeling locked out, ecological damage and climate volatility, information ecosystems that corrode trust and reward outrage, political systems that look more like deadlocked priesthoods of rival cults than like mechanisms for shared problem-solving. If you handed that symptom list to a priest from almost any of the traditions we visited, they would probably nod and say, in their own language, yeah, sounds like a late age. Taking that seriously doesn't require apocalyptic doom thinking. You don't have to assume a specific date, or a fiery sky, or a single chosen saviour. You can let the pattern work on you as a question. If this is what late-age stress looks like, if our arrangements really are fraying, what does it mean to live well inside that? Where do we need repentance? In the broadest sense, turning away from habits, industries, or institutions that obviously can't scale much longer without breaking something vital. Where do we need preservation? What knowledge, practices, and relationships are worth carrying through whatever storms are coming? Where do we need imagination? What might a healthier next configuration look like? If decline and crisis are the prelude, not the punchline. The danger of cyclical myths is that they can paralyze you. It's written, so nothing I do matters, or inflame you. It's all doomed anyway, so let's burn it faster. The opportunity is to let them sharpen your sense that your choices actually feed the pattern. Even if there is no secret cosmic calendar, your daily actions still help determine whether your tiny corner of the world is moving toward more cruelty or more mercy, more extraction or more care, more rigidity or more resilience. So maybe the most honest way to sit with these world-age stories is something like this. Hold lightly any claim to know where we are on some absolute, universe-wide timeline. Hold more seriously the diagnosis they offer about what it feels like when a way of living is reaching its limits. And hold very seriously the part that comes after the catastrophe in almost every version. There will be people on the other side of whatever this is. What are we doing now to make their world less of a wasteland? If the pattern is a mirror, the real question is not, when is the age ending? It's, looking at this reflection, what is it asking me and us to change before it does? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do you feel like you're living at the end of an age, personally or collectively? When you look at the Yugas, the Five Suns, Hesiod's metals, apocalyptic texts, does any of it resonate with your own experience? Or does it all feel purely symbolic? Let me know in the comments. And, as always, if you found this interesting or thought-provoking, it really does help the channel if you tap like, leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives like this one. I'm especially curious, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? Drop your location and local time below. One of the quiet joys of making these videos is seeing this weird, global, late-age feeling conversation unfold in real time. Thanks for spending this slice of your age here.